Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. In the year 1872, number 7, Savile Row, Burlington Gardens, was occupied by Phileas Fogg, Esquire. Of the members of the Reform Club in London, few, if any, were more peculiar or more specially noticed than Mr. Fogg, although he seemed to make a point of doing nothing that could draw attention to himself, and little was known about him. English he certainly was, though perhaps not a Londoner. No one had ever seen him at the Stock Exchange, or the bank, or at any of the offices in the city. Phileas Fogg was undeniably a wealthy man, but how he had made his fortune was more than the best informed could say, as no one could be more incommunicative than this gentleman. He spoke as little as possible, and this silence made him appear all the more mysterious. He had not left London for years, yet nobody had a more intimate knowledge of the map of the world. As far as anyone knew, he had neither wife nor child, which may happen to the most respectable people. More exceptionally, he had neither relations nor friends. Phileas Fogg lived by himself in his house in Savile Row, which nobody ever entered. Though not palatial, the house in Savile Row was commendable for extreme comfort, and the habits of its tenant being what they were, the service was very light. But Phileas Fogg required quite exceptional punctuality and regularity of his one servant. This very day, the 2nd of October, Mr. Fogg had dismissed James Foster, because the fellow had committed the offence of bringing him shaving water at 84 Fahrenheit instead of 86, and he was now expecting the new servant. There was a knock at the door of the morning room, and a man some 30 years of age presented himself and bowed. "You are a Frenchman, and your name is John?" queried Phileas Fogg. "Jean, if you please, sir," replied the newcomer. "Jean Passepartout. The surname has stuck to me, justified as it was by my natural gumption for getting out of scrapes. I have done many things, including street singing and tightrope walking, became a teacher of gymnastics, and last I was a sergeant of firemen in Paris. But it is now 5 years since I left France and became a valet in England, having a mind to see how I should like family life. Now, being out of a place, and hearing that Mr. Phileas Fogg was the most particular and most sedentary gentleman in the United Kingdom, I have come to you, sir, in the hope of living here in peace and quietness, and forgetting the very name of Passepartout." "Passepartout suits me very well," replied the gentleman. "You have been recommended to me. Your references are good. You know my terms?" "Yes, sir." "Well, then, from this moment, 11:29 a.m., Wednesday, October 2nd, 1872, you are in my service." Thereupon Phileas Fogg got up, took his hat with his left hand, put it on his head with the action of an automaton, and disappeared without saying another word. Passepartout had just had a very hurried glimpse of Phileas Fogg, but he had quickly, yet carefully, looked over his new master. His age might have been 40. His countenance was noble and handsome, his figure tall, and none the worse for a slight tendency to stoutness. His hair and whiskers were fair, his forehead was smooth, and bore no signs of wrinkles at the temples. Passepartout himself was a gentle, obliging creature, with one of those honest, round heads that you like to see on the shoulders of a friend. His eyes were blue, his complexion warm. His face was chubby enough to allow him to see his cheekbones. His chest was broad, his frame big and muscular, and he was endowed with Herculean strength, which had been admirably developed by the exercises of his youth. Alone in the house, Passepartout had no difficulty in finding, on the 3rd floor, the room intended for him. He liked it. Electric bells and speaking tubes enabled him to communicate with the rooms on the 1st and 2nd floors. On the mantelpiece stood an electric clock, synchronizing with the clock in Phileas Fogg's bedroom. The two timekeepers beat the same second at the very same instant. This is all right. This will suit me down to the ground, said Passepartout to himself. He likewise noticed in his room a card of instructions stuck over the clock. This was the daily service routine. From 8 o'clock in the morning, the regulation time at which Phileas Fogg got up, till 11:30, the hour at which he went out to lunch at the Reform Club, it specified every item of service. The tea and toast at 23 minutes past 8. The shaving water at 37 minutes past 9. The hairdressing at 20 minutes to 10, etc. Then from 12:30 in the morning to 12 at night, when the methodical gentleman went to bed, everything was noted down and settled in advance. Passepartout beamed and said happily, "We shall get on famously together, Mr. Fogg and I. A man of stay-at-home and regular habits. A real machine. Well, I'm not sorry to serve a machine." At the Reform Club, Phileas Fogg went straight into the dining room for lunch. At 47 minutes past 12, he got up and made his way to the big drawing room, where a servant handed him the uncut Times. The reading of this paper occupied Phileas Fogg till 45 minutes past 3, and that of the Standard, which followed, lasted till dinner. At 20 minutes to 6, he returned to the big drawing room and gave his whole attention to the Morning Chronicle. Half an hour later, several members of the Reform Club came in and drew near to the hearth on which burnt a coal fire. They were Mr. Phileas Fogg's habitual partners at whist, passionately fond of the game like himself. The engineer Andrew Stewart, the bankers John Sullivan and Samuel Fallentin, the brewer Thomas Flanagan, and Gautier Ralph, one of the governors of the Bank of England. "How now, Ralph?" said Thomas Flanagan. "What about this theft business?" "Well," replied Andrew Stewart, "the bank will lose the money." "I think not," said Gautier Ralph. "I hope we shall lay hands on the thief. Police inspectors, very smart fellows, have been sent to America and the continent, to all the principal ports, and the gentleman will have a job to escape them." "Have they his description, then?" asked Andrew Stewart. "In the first place, the man is not a thief," replied Gautier Ralph seriously. "Not a thief, what? The fellow who purloined £55,000 in banknotes?" "No," answered Gautier Ralph. "What then? Is he a manufacturer?" said Andrew Stewart. "The Morning Chronicle says he's a gentleman." The man who gave this reply was none other than Phileas Fogg, whose head was at that moment emerging from the sea of paper about him. The case in question, which was being keenly discussed in all the newspapers of the United Kingdom, had happened 3 days before, on the 29th of September. A bundle of banknotes, amounting to the enormous sum of £55,000, had been taken from the table of the chief cashier of the Bank of England. When the theft had been duly verified, picked detectives were sent to the principal ports, to Liverpool, Glasgow, Havre, Suez, Brindisi, New York, etc., and, in case of success, there was a promise of a reward of £2,000 and 5% of the sum recovered. The discussion continued even after they had sat down at a card table, Stewart opposite Flanagan and Fallentin opposite Phileas Fogg. When play started, conversation ceased, but it was renewed between the rubbers and became more and more heated. "I maintain," said Andrew Stewart, "that the chances are in favour of the thief, who is sure to be no fool." "Nonsense," replied Ralph. "There is not a country left in which he can take refuge. Where do you want him to go?" "I can't say," replied Andrew Stewart. "But after all, the world is large enough." "It was so," said Phileas Fogg in an undertone. "But now it is possible to go round it in as few as 80 days." This is how the Morning Chronicle tabulates the journey. And he read out. From London to Suez via Mont-Cenis and Brindisi by rail and boat, 7 days. From Suez to Bombay by boat, 13 days. From Bombay to Calcutta by rail, 3 days. From Calcutta to Hong Kong, China by boat, 13 days. From Hong Kong to Yokohama, Japan by boat, 6 days. From Yokohama to San Francisco by boat, 22 days. From San Francisco to New York by rail, 7 days. From New York to London by boat and rail, 9 days. Total, 80 days. Andrew Stuart said, In theory, you're right, Mr. Fogg, but practically... Practically too, Mr. Stuart, said Phileas Fogg. Well, Mr. Fogg, I will bet £4,000... My dear Stuart, said Valentin, calm yourself. This is not serious. When I make a bet, replied Andrew Stuart, I always mean what I say. Very well, said Mr. Fogg, turning to his fellow members. I have £20,000 on deposit at Baring's Bank. I am quite prepared to venture this sum. £20,000? exclaimed John Sullivan. £20,000 that you might lose through a single unforeseen delay? There is no such thing as the unforeseen, was Phileas Fogg's simple reply. I will bet £20,000 with anyone that I shall make the tour of the world in 80 days or less. That is, in 1920 hours or 115,200 minutes. Do you accept? Messrs. Stuart, Valentin, Sullivan, Flanagan, and Ralph consulted together and signified their acceptance. Very well, said Mr. Fogg. The Dover train leaves at 8:45. I shall take it. And since today is Wednesday the 2nd of October, I shall have to be back in London in this very drawing-room of the Reform Club on Saturday the 21st of December at 8:45 in the evening, in default of which the £20,000 deposited in my name at Baring's will be yours, gentlemen. Here is a cheque for the amount. A statement of the wager was written down and signed there and then by the 6 persons interested. Phileas Fogg remained quite cool. He had not made the bet to win, and had only staked these £20,000, the half of his fortune, because he foresaw he might have to spend the other half in order to achieve this difficult, not to say impracticable, project. Back home, Phileas Fogg called Passepartout and said, We shall start for Dover and Calais in 10 minutes. We are going to travel round the world. Passepartout, with wide staring eyes, hanging arms, and limp body, then showed all the symptoms of astonishment bordering on stupor. Around the world? He murmured. In 80 days, replied Mr. Fogg. So we must not lose a moment. But the trunks, said Passepartout, unconsciously swaying his head from side to side. No trunks, just a travelling bag. Put in 2 woolen shirts and 3 pairs of stockings, and the same for yourself. We shall buy what we require on the way. At 8 o'clock, Passepartout had got ready the humble bag which contained his wardrobe and his master's. Then, still very perturbed, he left his room, carefully closing the door, and went back to his master. Mr. Fogg was ready. He had under his arm Bradshaw's Continental Railway Steam Transit and General Guide, which was to provide him with all the information required for his journey. He took the bag from Passepartout's hands, opened it, and slipped into it a large bundle of those beautiful bank-notes which are current in all countries. Phileas Fogg and his servant jumped into a cab which conveyed them at a good pace to Charing Cross Station, the terminus of one of the branch lines of the South Eastern Railway. At the station, Mr. Fogg saw his 5 fellow members of the Reform Club. "Gentlemen," he said, "I am off. I am taking a passport with me, so that the various visas it will bear may enable you to check my itinerary when I return. Goodbye till we meet again, gentlemen." At 8:40, Phileas Fogg and his servant took their seats in the same compartment. At 8:45, a loud whistle was heard, and the train started. But before the train had passed Sydenham, Passepartout uttered a real cry of despair. "What's the matter?" asked Mr. Fogg. "In my hurry and flurry, I forgot to put out the gas in my room." "Well, my boy," replied Mr. Fogg coldly, "it will burn at your expense." An Englishman is by nature inclined to bet. So not only did the members of the Reform Club wager considerable sums for or against Phileas Fogg, but the great majority of the public joined in. But 7 days after his departure, something absolutely unexpected happened which put an end to all speculation on his success. During that day, at 9 o'clock in the evening, the chief of the Metropolitan Police received a telegram which ran thus: Suez, Rowan, Chief of Police, Scotland Yard, London. Am shadowing bank thief Phileas Fogg. Send without delay warrant for arrest Bombay. Detective Fix. The effect of this telegram was immediate. The honourable gentleman vanished and was replaced by the bank thief. His photograph, left at the Reform Club with those of all the other members, was examined and reproduced feature for feature the man whose description had been obtained at the inquiry. The mysterious peculiarities of Phileas Fogg's mode of life were then recalled, his lonely existence, his sudden departure, and it appeared evident that the fellow had invented a journey around the world and propped it up by an insane wager to the sole end of putting the English detectives off the scent. The telegram concerning Mr. Phileas Fogg had been dispatched in the following circumstances. On Wednesday, October 9th, the P&O liner Mongolia was expected at 11 a.m. at Suez. Awaiting the arrival of the Mongolia were 2 men, walking about the quay amid the crowd of natives and foreigners. One was the British consul, resident at Suez. The other was a thin little man, fairly intelligent-looking and wiry, who kept on knitting his eyebrows with remarkable persistency. This man's name was Fix. He was one of the English detectives who were sent to the different ports after the theft committed at the Bank of England. Fix was to keep the sharpest lookout on all travellers going through Suez, and should one of them seem suspicious, he was to shadow him until he received a warrant for his arrest. And 2 days before, Fix had received the description of the supposed culprit from the chief of the Metropolitan Police. It was that of the well-dressed, gentlemanly person who had been noticed in the pay-room of the bank. The detective, obviously much attracted by the substantial reward held out in case of success, was therefore awaiting the arrival of the Mongolia with impatience. "Mr. Fix," said the consul, "I cannot hear you without heartily wishing you all success. But I say it again, with the means at your disposal, I fear you will find it no easy task. Do you realize that, according to the description you have received, the thief looks exactly like an honest man?" "Sir," answered the detective dogmatically, "high-class thieves always look like honest people. You quite see that people with rascally faces have but one course open to them. They must keep straight, or they would be arrested." The consul returned to his office close by. The Mongolia cast anchor at 11 o'clock, and Fix scrutinized with the utmost care every one of the passengers as he stepped ashore. One of them came up to him, and asked with the utmost politeness if he could tell him where to find the British consulate. At the same time, the traveller held out a passport for which, apparently, he wished to procure the British official's visa. Fix instinctively took the passport and glanced rapidly through the description it contained. An involuntary sign of emotion nearly escaped him. The paper shook in his hand. The description in the passport was identical with that which he had received from Scotland Yard. "This passport is not yours, is it?" he asked. "No," replied the passenger. "It is my master's." "Where is your master?" "He has remained on board." "He will have to go to the consulate in person. rejoined the detective, "in order to prove his identity." "Oh, is that necessary?" "Absolutely necessary." "Where is this office?" "There at the corner of the square," replied Fix, pointing to a house 200 yards away. "All right, then, I will fetch my master, but he won't be best pleased to have the bother of coming." Having said this, the passenger bowed and returned to the liner. The detective made his way briskly down the quay to the consulate. "Sir," he said to the consul, "I have strong reasons for presuming that the man I am after is a passenger on board the Mongolia." He then related the incident of the passport. Shortly, Phileas Fogg arrived at the consulate with Passepartout. The consul signed and dated his passport and stamped it with his official seal. Mr. Fogg paid the required fee, bowed stiffly, and went out, followed by his servant. "Well?" said the detective. "Well," said the consul, "he looks a perfectly honest man." "Maybe," replied Fix, "but that is not the point. In your opinion, is this phlegmatic gentleman in every feature the exact picture of the thief whose description I hold?" "I agree, but as you know, all descriptions—" "I am going to make quite sure," broke in Fix. "The servant, I should say, is less inscrutable than the master. He's a Frenchman, too, so won't be able to keep his mouth shut. Goodbye for the present, consul." Meanwhile, Mr. Fogg, after leaving the consulate, made his way to the quay, gave some orders to his servant, took a boat, and returned to the Mongolia. In his notebook, he noted down his progress from London, Paris, Turin, and Brindisi. So far he had spent 6.5 days. On this Wednesday, October 9th, he noted down his arrival at Suez, by which, as it was in accordance with the scheduled time, he neither gained nor lost. Then he ordered lunch in his cabin. The thought of going ashore to see the town never occurred to him, for he was one of those Englishmen who, when travelling, leave their servants to do their sightseeing for them. Fix soon caught up Passepartout on the quay, and they walked off together, Passepartout talking away all the time. "There is one thing I must not do," he said. "That is, miss the boat." "There's plenty of time," answered Fix. "It's only 12 o'clock. Passepartout took out his big watch. 12 o'clock? He exclaimed. "Never. It is 8 minutes to 10. "Your watch is slow," replied Fix. "Oh, well, I see what's the matter. Your time is London time, which you have kept, which is about 2 hours behind that of Suez. You must be careful to set your watch by the midday hour of each country." "I meddle with my watch? Never!" cried Passepartout. "Well, if you don't, it will never agree with the sun." "So much the worse for the sun, sir. The sun will be at fault then, not my watch." And the honest fellow replaced his watch in his pocket with a gesture of defiant pride. A few moments later, Fix was saying to him, "So you left London in a great hurry?" "I should say we did. Last Wednesday Mr. Fogg came home from his club at 8 o'clock, a thing he never does, and 3/4 an hour later we were off." "But where is your master going?" "Right ahead all the time. He's going round the world." "Round the world?" cried Fix. "Yes, in 80 days. He says it's for a bet, but between us I don't believe a word of it. The thing would be too absurd. There must be some other reason." "Your Mr. Fogg is an odd sort of fellow, I see." "Oh, it seems so." "I suppose he's a wealthy man?" "Oh, yes. He's taking with him a large sum of money in brand-new banknotes, and he spends freely on the way. Why, he has promised a handsome reward to the engineer of the Mongolia if we get to Bombay well in advance of time." "You have known your master for some time, I suppose?" "No, I have not," answered Passepartout. "I entered his service on the very day of our departure." One can easily imagine what effect these replies were bound to produce on the detective's highly excited mind. Fix decided there and then to send a telegram to London for the immediate dispatch of a warrant of arrest to Bombay, take a berth on the Mongolia, shadow the thief to India, and there on British soil speak to him politely, a warrant in one hand and the other on his shoulder. On October the 10th, the day after they left Suez, Passepartout was rather pleased to see on deck the obliging person to whom he had applied for information on landing in Egypt. "If I am not mistaken," he said, accosting him with his most genial smile, "you are the gentleman who so kindly piloted me about in Suez." "Yes, of course," replied the detective. "I know you all right. You are the servant of that odd English fellow." "Quite right, Mr. Fix." "Mr. Fix," replied Passepartout. "I am delighted to find you on board. Where are you going?" "To Bombay, like yourself." "Is this your first trip to India?" "No," replied Fix. "I have been there several times. I am in the service of the Peninsular and Oriental Company." "Then you know the country?" "Yes, pretty well," answered Fix, who was anxious not to commit himself. The Mongolia arrived at Aden on the evening of the 14th, and she was not due before the morning of the 15th, a gain of 15 hours. Mr. Fogg and his servant went ashore, as Mr. Fogg wished to have his passport visaed. Fix followed him without being noticed. As soon as the passport was in order, Phileas Fogg returned on board and continued his interrupted game of whist. The Mongolia was not due at Bombay before the 22nd. She arrived on the 20th. This constituted a gain of 2 days since Phileas Fogg's departure from London, and, methodically, he noted it down in his itinerary in the column of gains. The passengers of the Mongolia landed at 4:30, and the train would leave Bombay for Calcutta at 8 exactly. So Mr. Fogg, after saying goodbye to his whist partners, left the liner, sent his servant to make a few purchases, giving him strict injunctions to be at the station before 8, and with that regular step of his, that marked the seconds like the pendulum of an astronomic clock, made his way to the passport office. On leaving the passport office, he quietly betook himself to the station and ordered dinner. Like Mr. Fogg, and very soon after, Fix left the Mongolia and hurried to the headquarters of the Bombay police, where he made himself known as a detective. He then explained the nature of the business which had been entrusted to him, his position with respect to the supposed culprit, and inquired whether a warrant had been received from London. The answer was in the negative. Of course, the warrant, having been dispatched after Fogg's departure, could not have arrived by then. Fix was sorely put out. He tried to induce the chief of the Bombay police to give him a warrant for Fogg's arrest. This the chief of police would not do, as the case concerned the London police, which alone was empowered by law to issue a warrant. But Fix felt convinced that Fogg would stay there some time, and meanwhile the warrant would arrive. Having bought some shirts and socks, Passepartout, on his way to the station, passed in front of the beautiful pagoda on the Malabar Hill, and an unlucky thought moved him to see its interior. Now, there are certain Indian pagodas which Christians are absolutely forbidden to enter, and into which even the faithful may not go without first leaving their shoes outside. Both these facts were quite unknown to Passepartout. It should be mentioned in this connection that the British government, from sound policy, not only respects the native religions, but enforces respect for the most trivial of native religious observances, and punishes severely anyone who offends against them. Having entered the Malabar Pagoda in all innocence, and like any simple tourist, Passepartout was gazing in admiration upon the dazzling tinsel of Brahmin ornamentation, when all of a sudden he was knocked down on the sacred flagging. 3 furious-looking priests flung themselves upon him, wrenched off his shoes and socks, and proceeded to belabour him, uttering savage yells the while. The Frenchman, powerful and agile, was on his feet in a moment. With one blow of his fist, he knocked down one of his adversaries, and with a kick he sent another sprawling, the long robes by which they were hampered making this the easier. Then, rushing out of the pagoda as fast as his legs would carry him, he soon left a long way behind him the 3rd Hindu, who had hastened to give chase, hounding on the crowd as he went. At 5 minutes to 8, a few minutes only before the departure of the train, Passepartout reached the station, hatless and barefooted, and without the parcel containing his purchases, which had been lost in the scuffle. Fix had followed Fogg to the station, and was there on the platform. He now perceived that the rogue was leaving Bombay, and at once made up his mind to accompany him as far as Calcutta or farther, if necessary. Passepartout did not see Fix, who stood in a dark recess, but when he gave his master a hurried account of his adventures, Fix overheard him. "I trust you will not do this sort of thing again," was all Phileas Fogg said in reply as he took his seat in the train. The poor fellow, barefooted and utterly dejected, followed his master without saying a word. Fix was on the point of stepping into another carriage, when a sudden idea made him there and then change his mind and stay. "Wait a minute," he said to himself. "This is an offence committed on Indian soil. I've got him." At that moment the engine whistled loud, and the train vanished in the darkness of the night. Passepartout was travelling in the same compartment as his master, and a third passenger faced them, seated in one of the opposite corners. This was Sir Francis Cromarty, one of the men who had played whist with Mr. Fogg during the passage from Suez to Bombay, now on his way back to his men in cantonments near Benares. Sir Francis Cromarty, a tall, fair man of some 50 years of age, had greatly distinguished himself in the last sepoy revolt. At 12:30 the train stopped at Burhanpur, and Passepartout was able to buy a pair of Indian slippers ornamented with false pearls, for which he gave an exorbitant price, and which he proceeded to put on with unconcealed vanity. On the morrow, October the 22nd, in reply to a question from Sir Francis Cromarty, Passepartout looked at his watch and said it was 3 o'clock in the morning. And as this precious watch was still set by the Greenwich meridian, now some 77 degrees west of them, it was, and was likely to be, 4 hours slow. Sir Francis corrected Passepartout's time, repeating what Fix had already told him. He tried to make him see that the watch should be set by each new meridian, and that, as he was constantly advancing eastward, that is to say, meeting the sun, the days were shorter by as many times 4 minutes as there were degrees travelled through. The Brigadier General's explanation, whether understood or not, was completely thrown away on Passepartout, who obstinately refused to put his watch on. The stubborn fellow, obsessed by this perfectly harmless mania, kept it ever at London time. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the train stopped in the middle of an extensive glade, on the border of which were a few bungalows and workmen's huts. The guard in charge of the train passed along the carriages shouting, "All change! All change!" Phileas Fogg looked at Sir Francis Cromarty, who seemed amazed at this halt in the heart of a forest. Passepartout, equally surprised, jumped down on the line and came back almost at once, shouting, "Sir, that's the end of the railway!" "Whatever do you mean?" asked Sir Francis Cromarty. "I mean that the train does not go any farther." The Brigadier General got out at once, and Phileas Fogg got out too, but in a leisurely way. Both questioned the guard. "Where are we?" asked Sir Francis. "At Colby Hamlet," answered the guard. "Do we stop here?" "Of course. The railway isn't finished." "Not finished? What?" "There's a section of some 50 miles to be laid from here to Allahabad, where the line begins again." "But the papers announced the opening of the line right through." "Well, sir, the papers made a mistake." "But you issue tickets from Bombay to Calcutta," said Sir Francis Cromarty, who was getting angry. "Certainly," replied the guard, "but the passengers are aware that they will have to find means of transport from Colby to Allahabad." Sir Francis was furious, and Passepartout would have felled the guard with pleasure, though the guard had nothing to do with it. He dared not look at his master. "Sir Francis," said Mr. Fogg quietly, "if you are agreeable, we will set about procuring the means of getting to Allahabad. I have 2 days to the good, which I must sacrifice. There is a boat leaving Calcutta for Hong Kong at noon on the 25th. Today is the 22nd. We shall get to Calcutta in time." The majority of the travellers knew of this break in the line. On getting out of the train, they at once proceeded to secure every kind of conveyance to be found in the little town. 4-wheeled palki garis, carts drawn by zebus, a sort of humped oxen, travelling cars that looked like pagodas on wheels, palanquins, ponies, all these and other vehicles were pressed into service. The result was that Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty, after looking everywhere, came back having found nothing. "I shall walk," said Phileas Fogg. Passepartout, coming up at this moment, heard him and made an expressive grimace as he looked down at his gorgeous but flimsy slippers. Very fortunately, he too had been trying to find something, and, speaking with some diffidence, he said, "Sir, I think I have found a conveyance." "What is it?" "An elephant. An elephant belonging to an Indian who lives but 100 yards from here." "Well, let us go and see the elephant," replied Mr. Fogg. 5 minutes later, Phileas Fogg, Sir Francis Cromarty, and Passepartout reached a hut adjoining a paddock with a very high paling. The hut contained an Indian, and the paddock an elephant. At their request, the Indian took Mr. Fogg and his 2 companions into the paddock. There they found an animal that was only half domesticated, and that its owner had reared not as a beast of burden, but as a beast of combat. With that object in view, he had begun to alter the naturally gentle disposition of the elephant so as to bring him gradually to that intense state of fury which the Hindus term mulch. This he did by feeding him for 3 months on sugar and butter. The treatment may appear unlikely to produce such a result, but it is nonetheless used with success by trainers. Most fortunately for Mr. Fogg, this elephant had only just commenced the diet, and mulch had not broken out as yet. Like all animals of the same kind, Kiuni, its name was Kiuni, could travel rapidly for a long time at a stretch, so, in default of every other sort of mount, Phileas Fogg determined to make use of him. But elephants are not so plentiful as they were in India, and are therefore far from cheap. Phileas Fogg offered to purchase the beast, and straightway suggested £1,000. Its owner, possibly scenting a magnificent bargain, said he did not want to sell. Phileas Fogg offered first £1,200, then £1,500, then £1,800, and finally £2,000. Passepartout, usually so red, was pale with emotion. At £2,000 the Indian gave in. "By my slippers!" exclaimed Passepartout. "What price elephants stake after this?" They still needed a guide. A bright-looking young Parsee offered his services, which Mr. Fogg accepted, promising him high remuneration. The elephant was brought out and equipped without delay. The Parsee, who was an expert rider, covered the animal's back with a sort of saddle-cloth, and fixed on either side a couple of rather uncomfortable litters. Mr. Fogg thereupon offered to carry Sir Francis Cromarty to Allahabad station, and the offer was accepted. One more traveller would not overtire the gigantic beast. Provisions were procured at Colby, and Sir Francis and Phileas Fogg, having taken their seats in the howdahs, Passepartout placed himself astride between his master and the brigadier, and the Parsee perched himself on the elephant's neck. At 9 o'clock they left the small town, and made their way by the shortest cut into the thick forest of fan palms. The Parsee, to whom the roads and paths of the locality were quite familiar, declared there would be a gain of 20 miles in striking across the forest, and they took his word for it. The main range of the Vindhyas was crossed at 8 o'clock in the evening, and the travellers made a halt in a dilapidated bungalow at the foot of the northern slope. The journey was resumed at 6 in the morning, and the guide hoped to reach Allahabad station that very evening. So Mr. Fogg would lose only a part of the 48 hours he had saved since the beginning of his venture. At 2 o'clock the guide entered a dense forest, across which he would have to travel for several miles. He preferred to remain under cover of the woods. So far, at all events, there had been no unpleasant encounter, and it looked as if the journey would be successfully accomplished, when the elephant, showing signs of uneasiness, stopped dead. It was then 4 o'clock. "What's the matter?" asked Sir Francis Cromarty, looking out of his howdah. "I don't know, sir," replied the Parsee, listening attentively to a confused murmur that came along under the thick branches. The Parsee jumped down, tied the elephant to a tree, and disappeared in the thickest part of the wood. He returned a few minutes later, saying, "It is a procession of Brahmins coming this way. We must avoid being seen if possible." The guide untied the elephant and led him into a thicket, telling the travellers to be sure not to dismount, and holding himself in readiness to mount quickly should flight become necessary. the discordant sound of voices and instruments drew nearer. Monotonous chants mingled with the beating of drums and clanging of cymbals. The head of the procession soon made its appearance under the trees, some 50 yards away from the position occupied by Mr. Fogg and his companions, and they could easily distinguish through the branches the strange performers of this religious ceremony. First came the priests, wearing mitres and clothed in flowing embroidered robes. They were surrounded by men, women, and children, singing a kind of dirge, interrupted at regular intervals by the tom-toms and cymbals. Behind them stood a hideous statue on a car with wide wheels, the spokes and felly of which represented serpents coiled about each other. Around the statue was a group of old fakirs, striped with ochre and covered with crosswise cuts. Next came a few Brahmins, in all the splendour of their oriental vestments, leading a woman who could scarcely stand. She was a young woman with a skin as white as a European's. Her head, neck, and shoulders, her ears, arms, hands, and toes were weighed down with jewels, necklaces, bracelets, earrings, and rings. And a tunic spangled with gold and veiled with light muslin showed the outline of her figure. In violent contrast to the spectacle presented by this young woman were some guards who followed her, armed with naked sabres hanging from their waists, and long damascened pistols, and carrying a corpse on a palanquin. This was the body of an old man, clothed in his gorgeous Rajah's raiment. As Sir Francis Cromarty observed all this ceremony, his face bore a singularly sad expression, and, turning to the guide, he said, "A suttee." The Parsee nodded and raised a finger to his lips. The long procession slowly passed away under the trees, and soon its rear ranks disappeared in the depths of the forest. As soon as the procession had disappeared, Phileas Fogg, who had heard the word uttered by Sir Francis Cromarty, asked what a suttee was. "A suttee, Mr. Fogg," answered the Brigadier General, "is a human sacrifice, but a voluntary sacrifice. The young woman you have just seen will be burnt tomorrow at early dawn." "Oh, the villains!" cried Passepartout, unable to restrain his indignation. "What about that corpse?" asked Mr. Fogg. "It is the body of the prince, her husband," said the guide. He went on, "The sacrifice that will take place tomorrow at sunrise is not a voluntary one." "How do you know?" "Everybody in Buldelkhand knows the story," answered the guide. "The wretched woman appeared to be offering no resistance," observed Sir Francis. "That was because she had been intoxicated with the fumes of hemp and opium." "But where are they taking her?" "To the pagoda of Pillaji, 2 miles from here. She will pass the night there, awaiting the hour of her sacrifice." "And the sacrifice will take place when?" "Tomorrow, at earliest dawn." So saying, the guide led the elephant out of the thick cover and scrambled up to his neck. But just as he was about to urge the animal forward by means of a peculiar whistle, Mr. Fogg stopped him, and speaking to Sir Francis Cromarty, he said, "What if we rescued this woman?" "Rescue this woman, Mr. Fogg?" cried the Brigadier. "I still have 12 hours to the good. I can devote them to this." "By Jove! You are a man of heart, then!" exclaimed Sir Francis. "Occasionally," replied Phileas Fogg quietly, "when I have time." Sir Francis asked the guide if he would help them. "Officer," replied the guide, "I am a Parsee, and this woman is a Parsee. I am yours to command." The good Indian then told them a few particulars concerning the victim. She was a celebrated beauty of the Parsee race, the daughter of a wealthy Bombay merchant. She had received a thoroughly English education in that city, and from her manners and attainments she would be taken for a European. Her name was Aouda. Being left an orphan, she was married against her will to this old Rajah of Bundelkhand. 3 months after, she became a widow, and, knowing the fate that was in store for her, she escaped, but was at once recaptured and doomed by the Rajah's relatives, who were interested in her death, to this sacrifice from which apparently there was no escape. It was decided that the guide should direct the elephant towards the pagoda of Pillaji and get as near to it as possible. Half an hour later, they halted under cover of a copse, 500 yards from the pagoda, which was just visible, while the howls of the fanatics were distinctly heard. Mr. Fogg and his companions waited for the night. As soon as it was dark, about 6 o'clock, they decided to make a reconnaissance around the pagoda. The last cries of the fakirs were just coming to an end. According to custom, the Indians must be heavily intoxicated with bhang, liquid opium mixed with infusion of hemp. It might therefore be possible to slip in between them and reach the temple. Followed by Mr. Fogg, Sir Francis, and Passepartout, the guide made his way noiselessly through the forest. After crawling 10 minutes under the branches, they came to the bank of a small stream, where, by the light of resin burning at the end of iron torches, they saw a pile of wood. This was the pyre, made of costly sandal, and already soaked in perfumed oil. On the top lay the embalmed body of the Rajah, which was to be burnt together with his widow. The pagoda, whose minarets were dimly seen rising above the tops of the trees, stood 100 yards away from the pyre. To the guide's great disappointment, the guards of the Rajahs, lighted by smoky torches, were keeping watch at the doors and walking to and fro with drawn swords. There was nothing for it but to wait. The hours passed, and lighter shades heralded the approach of dawn, though it was still very dark. The moment had come. The slumbering crowd rose as if from the sleep of death. The various groups began to bestir themselves. Drums resounded. Songs and cries broke out anew. The hour was at hand when the unfortunate woman must die. The doors of the pagoda burst open, and a brighter light escaped from the interior. Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty now caught sight of the victim in the vivid glare, as she was being taken out by 2 priests. Phileas Fogg and his companions, mixing with the last ranks of the crowd, followed. In 2 minutes they reached the bank of the river, and stopped less than 50 paces from the pyre on which lay the Rajah's body. In the semi-obscurity they perceived the victim perfectly inert, lying beside her husband's corpse. Then a torch was applied, and the wood, soaked with oil, blazed up at once. It was then that Sir Francis Cromarty and the guide held back Phileas Fogg, who, in a moment of generous frenzy, was in the act of dashing towards the pyre. But Phileas Fogg had already thrust them aside, when a sudden change came over the scene. There was a cry of terror, and the whole multitude fell prostrate, stricken with dismay. The old Rajah, then, was not dead, for here he was, rising suddenly like a phantom, taking up the young woman in his arms, and coming down from the pyre enveloped in whirling clouds which gave him a spectral appearance. The fakirs, guards, and priests, seized with panic, lay there with their faces to the ground, not daring to lift their eyes and look upon such a miracle. The insensible victim was carried along in the strong arms that held her, and for which she seemed a light burden. Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis were erect at the same place. The Parsee had bowed his head, and doubtless Passepartout was no less dumbfounded. The resuscitated man moved in this manner as far as Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis, and there gave the abrupt order, "Let us be off!" It was none other than Passepartout, who had made his way to the pyre in the midst of the thick smoke, and, taking advantage of the darkness, which was still opaque, had snatched the young woman from the jaws of death. It was Passepartout who, playing his part with lucky audacity, was able to go right through the crowd during the ensuing panic. A moment later, all 4 had disappeared in the woods, and the elephant was taking them away at a speedy trot. But the shouts and hubbub, and a bullet that made a hole in Phileas Fogg's hat, told them that their stratagem was discovered. On the blazing pyre the old Rajah's body was now plainly visible, and the priests, recovering from their terror, and perceiving that an abduction had just been effected, rushed headlong into the forest, with the guards close behind them. A volley was fired at the captors, but in a few moments their rapid flight took them beyond the reach of bullets and arrows. The bold abduction had been quite successful. The elephant, directed with unerring skill by the Parsee, was making rapid progress through the forest, though it was still dark, and an hour after leaving the pagoda of Pillaji, he was travelling at great speed across an immense plain. Sir Francis told Phileas Fogg plainly that, should Aouda remain in India, she would inevitably fall again into the hands of her executioners. These fanatics were to be found throughout the peninsula. In his opinion, the young woman would not be really safe until she had left India. Phileas Fogg replied that he would keep this in mind and see what could be done. About 10 o'clock, the guide was at Allahabad. The interrupted line started there again, and trains ran from Allahabad to Calcutta in less than 24 hours. Phileas Fogg would therefore arrive in time to take a boat due to leave Calcutta on the next day, October 25th, at noon, for Hong Kong. The young woman was taken to a room at the station, and Passepartout was entrusted with the task of purchasing for her various requisites of a lady's toilet: a dress, a shawl, some furs, etc. In fact, anything necessary that he could find. Phileas Fogg turned to the Parsee. "Parsee," he said to the guide, "you have been useful and devoted. I have paid you for your service, but not for your devotion. Would you like the elephant? If so, it is yours." The guide's eyes glowed. "Your honour is giving me a fortune," he exclaimed. "Accept my offer," replied Mr. Fogg. "I shall still be your debtor." "Splendide!" cried Passepartout. The elephant gave a grunt or two of satisfaction, and seizing Passepartout around the waist with his trunk, lifted him as high as his head. Passepartout, not in the least frightened, gave the animal a friendly pat, and was gently replaced on the ground. A few minutes later, Phileas Fogg, Sir Francis Cromarty, and Passepartout, having taken their seats in a comfortable carriage, in which Aouda occupied the best place, were running at full speed on their way to Benares. The distance between the latter town and Allahabad is at most 80 miles, and the run took 2 hours. During the journey, the young Indian became herself completely. The effects of the stupefying fumes of the hemp and opium had passed away. What was her amazement on finding herself in this railway carriage, dressed in European garments, and in the company of travellers who were absolute strangers. Their very first care was to restore her completely, and to this end, among many attentions, they made her drink a few drops of spirit. The brigadier then proceeded to inform her of what had happened to her. Aouda thanked her deliverers effusively, more by her tears than by her words. Then, as her thoughts travelled back to the scenes of the Sati, and she looked once more on this land of India, where she had still so many dangers to face, she shuddered with terror. Phileas Fogg, who perceived what was passing in her mind, tried to reassure her, and offered in his coldest manner to take her to Hong Kong, where she could stay until the affair had blown over. The offer was gratefully accepted. It so happened that Aouda had a relation living at Hong Kong, a Parsee like herself, and one of the leading merchants in that city, which is quite English, though situated off the coast of China. The train pulled up at Benares at 12:30. Sir Francis Cromarty was not going beyond Benares, so he bade the travellers goodbye and good luck. After Benares, the railway followed the valley of the Ganges for a time. Night came, and the train passed on at full speed in the midst of the roaring of tigers and bears and the howling of wolves. Calcutta was reached at 7 o'clock in the morning, and the boat about to sail for Hong Kong would not weigh anchor before 12. Phileas Fogg had 5 hours to spare. According to his timetable, he was to arrive at the Indian capital on the 25th of October, 23 days after leaving London, and he had arrived on the appointed day. He was therefore neither behind nor before his time. Phileas Fogg intended to go straight to the Hong Kong boat, in order to see Aouda comfortably settled for the voyage. He was anxious to be with her until she left a country so full of danger for her. Just as he was leaving the station, a policeman walked up to him and said, "Mr. Phileas Fogg?" "That is my name." "Is this man your servant?" asked the policeman, pointing to Passepartout. "Yes." "Be good enough to follow me." He took Phileas Fogg, Passepartout, and Aouda to an unpretentious-looking house, which was obviously not a private residence. The policeman conducted them into a room with barred windows, where he said to them, "You will appear before Judge Obadiah at 8:30. He then withdrew and shut the door. "But the boat leaves at 12, observed Passepartout. "We shall be on board before 12, was all his imperturbable master replied. At 8:30, the door opened, and the policeman ushered the prisoners into the adjoining room. This was the court, and the part reserved for the public was occupied by a fairly numerous gathering of Europeans and natives. Mr. Fogg, Aouda, and Passepartout sat down on a bench opposite the seats reserved for the magistrate and the clerk of the court. A moment after, Judge Obadiah, a stout, rotund-looking man, entered, followed by the clerk. "The first case," said Judge Obadiah. "Phileas Fogg?" called out the clerk. "Here," answered Mr. Fogg. "Passepartout?" "Here," replied Passepartout. "All right," said the judge. "Bring in the plaintiffs." A door swung open, and 3 priests were shown in by an usher.
"That is it, of course," muttered Passepartout. "There are the scoundrels who wish to burn our young lady."
The priests remained standing before the judge, and the clerk read in a loud voice a charge of sacrilege against Phileas Fogg and his servant, who were accused of having violated a place consecrated by the Brahmin religion. "You have heard the accusation?" the judge asked Phileas Fogg. "Yes, sir," replied Mr. Fogg, consulting his watch. "I confess, and I am waiting for these 3 priests to confess in their turn what they intended to do in the pagoda of Pelagi." The priests looked at each other, apparently unable to understand anything of the defendant's statement. "Certainly," replied Passepartout indignantly. "At the pagoda of Pelagi, in front of which they were about to burn their victim." The priests were again astounded, and the judge asked in amazement, "What victim? Burn whom? In the heart of Bombay?" "Bombay?" exclaimed Passepartout. "Yes, Bombay. This has nothing to do with the pagoda of Pelagi, but with the pagoda of Malabar Hill." "And as a proof," added the clerk, "here are the desecrator's shoes." And he deposited a pair of shoes on his desk. "My shoes!" exclaimed Passepartout. He and his master had clean forgotten this incident of the Bombay pagoda. Detective Fix had taken upon himself to advise the priests of Malabar Hill. He held out to them the prospect of heavy damages, knowing full well that the English government treated this sort of offence with great severity. He had waited for Phileas Fogg's arrival at Calcutta, and had at once directed a policeman to take him into custody. "The facts are admitted?" asked the judge. "They are admitted," replied Mr. Fogg coldly. "Then," said the judge, "I condemn the said Passepartout to go to prison for 15 days and to pay a fine of £300. £300? cried Passepartout, to whom the fine alone was a matter of concern. "Silence!" yelped the usher. "And," added Judge Obadiah, "inasmuch as it is not substantially established that there was no connivance between the servant and his master, and as in any case the master must be held responsible for the doings of a paid servant, I condemn the said Phileas Fogg to 8 days' imprisonment and a fine of £150. Phileas Fogg stood up and said, "I am prepared to give bail." "That is your right," replied the judge. "As Phileas Fogg and his servant are strangers, each of them will have to find bail for the enormous sum of £1,000. "Here is the money," said Phileas Fogg, and from the bag in Passepartout's keeping he took out a bundle of banknotes, which he placed on the clerk's desk. "This money will be returned to you when you leave prison," said the judge. "In the meantime, you are liberated on bail." "Come along," said Phileas Fogg to his servant. Mr. Fogg at once took a carriage for himself and his 2 companions, and they drove off. Fix, thereupon, ran behind the carriage, which soon stopped on one of the quays. Half a mile away, in the roadstead, the Rangoon lay at anchor, with the Blue Peter at the masthead. 11 o'clock was striking. Mr. Fogg was an hour in advance of time. Fix saw him get down from the carriage and put out in a small boat with Aouda and his servant. The detective stamped his foot with rage. "The scoundrel is off once more," he cried. £2,000 gone, but I'll shadow him to the end of the world. The passage on the Rangoon was one of only 11 days. During the first days of the voyage, Aouda became better acquainted with Phileas Fogg, and lost no opportunity of showing him her intense gratitude. But all her protestations, apparently at least, left the phlegmatic gentleman perfectly cold. Aouda was rather puzzled by this attitude, but Passepartout enlightened her to some extent on his master's eccentric character. He told her of the wager which was hurrying him round the world, which made Aouda smile. Leaving instructions at Calcutta that the warrant, should it arrive, was to be dispatched to him at Hong Kong, Detective Fix had managed to embark on the Rangoon without being seen by Passepartout. Hong Kong was English soil, but it was the last English soil they would touch. Beyond that, China, Japan, America all held out to the man Fogg a practically safe retreat. Fix stayed hidden in his cabin until the 30th of October, and the Rangoon was due at Singapore on the morrow. Passepartout was walking about on the forepart of the ship when the detective rushed at him with the exclamation, "What, you here on the Rangoon?" "You on board, Mr. Fix?" replied Passepartout in amazement as he recognized his fellow passenger of the Mongolia. "This beats me." Passepartout, by what seemed to him a flash of intuition, discovered a highly probable reason for Fix's abiding presence. Fix, he concluded, must be an agent sent by Mr. Fogg's fellow members of the Reform Club, with orders to follow him closely and ascertain that he really travelled round the world along the route agreed upon. Delighted with his discovery, Passepartout decided, nonetheless, to say nothing about it to his master. At 4 o'clock in the morning on the next day, the Rangoon, 12 hours in advance of her scheduled time, called at Singapore in order to take in a new supply of coal. At 11 o'clock, having finished coaling, she weighed anchor, and a few hours later her passengers lost sight of the high mountains of Malacca, with their forests where lurk the finest tigers in the world. Some 300 miles of sea separate Singapore from the island of Hong Kong, a small English possession off the Chinese coast. It was important for Phileas Fogg that the voyage should not take more than 6 days, as he would then be in time to catch the boat due to leave Hong Kong on November the 6th for Yokohama, one of the chief ports of Japan. On the 3rd and 4th of November, they encountered a gale which lashed the sea with fury. The ship's pace was, of course, considerably slowed, and it was reasonably estimated that she would reach Hong Kong 20 hours behind time, and even more if the storm continued. Phileas Fogg contemplated this raging sea that seemed to be battling against him personally with his usual serenity. His brow was not clouded for one moment, although a delay of 20 hours might be the cause of failure by making him miss the boat at Yokohama. For Fix, the matter had a very different aspect. The storm delighted him. His satisfaction would have been boundless if the Rangoon had been forced to turn and run before the hurricane. All these delays fitted in with his schemes, for they would compel this man Fogg to remain a few days in Hong Kong. Land was not signalled before the 6th, at 5 o'clock in the morning. According to Phileas Fogg's timetable, the liner was to arrive on the 5th. He would therefore be 24 hours late, and would necessarily miss the connection with Yokohama. At 6 o'clock, the pilot stepped on board the Rangoon and went up on the bridge in order to steer the ship through the fairway into Hong Kong harbour. Phileas Fogg asked the pilot whether he knew when there would be a boat for Yokohama. "At high tide tomorrow morning," replied the pilot. "Is that so?" said Mr. Fogg, without showing the slightest surprise. Passepartout, who heard this, would have been happy to embrace the pilot, while Fix would have gladly wrung his neck. "What is the name of the ship?" asked Mr. Fogg. "The Carnatic," replied the pilot. "Was she not due to sail yesterday?" "Yes, sir, but one of her boilers had to undergo repairs, so her departure was put off till tomorrow." But for this necessary repair to her boilers, the Carnatic would have left on the 5th of November, and the passengers for Japan would have had to wait 8 days for the sailing of the next boat. They would leave Yokohama 24 hours late, but the voyage through the Pacific lasts 22 days, and in that time it would be easy to make good these 24 hours. Phileas Fogg returned to the club hotel and informed Aouda that her relative was no longer in Hong Kong, but was now in Holland. In her gentle voice she said, "What am I to do, Mr. Fogg?" "It is very simple," he replied. return with us to Europe."
"But I cannot abuse your—"
"You abuse nothing, and your presence does not interfere in the least with my plan. Passepartout, go and engage 3 cabins on the Carnatic." Passepartout hurried out on his errand, delighted that he was not to lose the company of the young woman who always treated him with great kindness. Passepartout proceeded to find the quay whence the Carnatic would sail, and saw Fix walking to and fro. He was not surprised at finding the detective there, but noticed that his face showed signs of intense disappointment. "Good," said Passepartout to himself. "Things are not going well for the gentlemen of the Reform Club." He went up to Fix. "Well, Mr. Fix, have you made up your mind to come with us as far as America?" asked Passepartout. "Yes," replied Fix, through clenched teeth. "Ho, ho, ho! Come, come!" cried Passepartout, breaking into a loud guffaw. "Didn't I know that you could not leave us? Come and book your passage. Come along." Thereupon they went together to the company's office and engaged cabins for 4 persons. The clerk informed them that the Carnatic's repairs were finished, and that the ship would consequently sail that very evening at 8 o'clock, and not the next morning, as had been announced. "All the better," replied Passepartout. "This will fit in excellently with my master's plans. I will go at once and let him know." At this moment, Fix decided on an extreme measure, and determined to tell Passepartout everything, as it was perhaps the only means at his command for keeping back Phileas Fogg a few days at Hong Kong. When they left the office, Fix offered his companion a drink. Passepartout, having plenty of time, accepted the invitation. There was a pleasant-looking tavern on the quay, and they went in and found themselves in a large, well-decorated room, at the far end of which was a camp bed covered with cushions, and on this bed lay a certain number of persons asleep. Some 30 customers were seated at small tables made of plaited rushes. A few were draining mugs of English beer or porter, others jugs of spirits, gin or brandy. Most of them were also smoking long red clay pipes stuffed with small pellets of opium mingled with attar of roses. From time to time, one of the smokers, overcome by the fumes, would slip under the table, and the waiters, taking him by the head and feet, carried him away and deposited him on the camp bed beside a fellow sleeper. About 20 of these inebriates were thus laid out on the bed, side by side, in the last stage of stupefied intoxication. Fix and Passepartout perceived that the place they were in was an opium smoking-house. Passepartout had no money, but he readily accepted his companion's friendly offer, intending to return the compliment on some future occasion. 2 bottles of port were ordered, to which the Frenchman did ample justice, whilst Fix, drinking more cautiously, observed him with the closest attention. They chatted about one thing and another, and in particular about Fix's splendid idea of booking a berth on the Carnatic. Talking of the ship reminded Passepartout of her sailing some hours before the time announced, so, the bottles being empty, he got up to go and inform his master. "Stay," said Fix. "I want to talk to you about a serious matter." "A serious matter?" exclaimed Passepartout, drinking a few drops of wine left at the bottom of his glass. "Stay," replied Fix. "This concerns your master." On hearing this, Passepartout looked at Fix attentively, and the expression on his face struck him as being so strange that he sat down again and said, "Well, what is this you have to say to me?" Fix said quietly, "I am a police inspector, sent out on special duty by Scotland Yard, and I will prove it. Here is my warrant." Thereupon the official took a paper from his pocket-book and showed his companion a warrant signed by the head of the London police. Passepartout, absolutely dumbfounded, gazed at Fix, unable to utter a word. "Fogg's wager," continued Fix, "is nothing but a blind which has taken you all in, you and his fellow members of the Reform Club. Listen. On the 29th of last September, a theft of £55,000 was committed at the Bank of England by a person whose description was fortunately obtained. Now, this description is in every feature a true one of the man Fogg." "What nonsense!" cried Passepartout, striking the table with a bang of his powerful fist. Fix went on, "I have tracked Fogg as far as here, but I have not yet received the warrant of arrest for which I applied in London. You must therefore help me to keep him back here in Hong Kong. You want me to... And I will share with you the reward of £2,000 to be given by the Bank of England. Never, replied Passepartout, who tried to rise but fell back, feeling that both his reason and his strength were leaving him. Mr. Fix, he stammered, even though everything you have told me were true, though my master were the thief you are looking for, which I deny, I have been and am still in his service. I have never seen him anything but good and generous. I betray him never. You refuse? I refuse. Then take it that I have said nothing, and let us drink on it. All right, let us drink. Passepartout felt he was getting more and more intoxicated. Fix, seeing that come what might he must separate him from his master, decided to incapacitate him completely. There were a few pipes filled with opium on the table. Fix slipped one of these into Passepartout's hand. He seized it, raised it to his lips, lit it, drew a few puffs out of it, and collapsed, stupefied by the narcotic. At last, said Fix, seeing Passepartout down and out. That man Fogg will not be informed in time of the hour of the sailing of the Carnatic, and if he does get away, he will at all events go without that cursed Frenchman. He then paid the bill and left the tavern. Phileas Fogg was surprised at the failure of his servant to appear at bedtime, but as he knew the boat would not leave for Yokohama until the next morning, the matter caused him no anxiety. Next morning, Passepartout did not answer his master's bell, and Mr. Fogg was told that his servant had not returned to the hotel. What he thought of it no one could have told, for all he did was to take his travelling bag, send word to Aouda, and order a palanquin. It was then 8 o'clock. At 9:30 it would be high tide, and the Carnatic would then be able to leave port. The palanquin having arrived, Mr. Fogg and Aouda got into this comfortable conveyance, and their luggage followed them in a wheelbarrow. Half an hour later, the travellers descended on the quay, and Mr. Fogg was told that the Carnatic had sailed the day before. He had expected to find the liner and his servant, and now he was forced to face the loss of both. But his face showed not the slightest sign of disappointment, and as Aouda looked at him anxiously, all he said was, "It is a mere incident, madam, nothing more." At this moment, a man who had been observing him attentively came up to him. It was Fix, who bowed, saying, "Were you not, sir, like myself, a passenger on the Rangoon, which arrived yesterday?" "Yes, I was, sir," replied Mr. Fogg coldly. Fix said, "I am extremely disappointed. Her repairs being completed, the Carnatic left Hong Kong 12 hours sooner than she was expected to do, and without notice, and now we shall have to wait a week for the next boat." As he uttered the words "a week," Fix felt his heart leap with joy. A week! Fogg kept back a week in Hong Kong. This would give him time to receive the warrant. At last, luck was showing itself favourable to the representative of the law. One can imagine what a stunning blow he received when he heard Phileas Fogg say in his cool, quiet tone of voice, "But it seems to me there are other ships beside the Carnatic in Hong Kong harbour." And Mr. Fogg, offering his arm to Aouda, made his way to the docks in search of a ship about to sail. Fix followed in a state of amazement. It looked as though he were tied to this man by a thread. For 3 hours Phileas Fogg thoroughly searched the docks, having decided to charter a ship, if necessary, to convey him to Yokohama. But all the vessels he saw were either loading or unloading, and consequently could not make ready for sea. Fix began to hope again. But then Phileas Fogg was accosted by a sailor on the outer harbour. "Is your honour looking for a boat?" asked the sailor, uncovering. "Have you a boat ready to sail?" asked Mr. Fogg. "Yes, your honour, a pilot boat," said the man. "Will you undertake to carry me to Yokohama?" asked Phileas Fogg. On hearing this proposal, the sailor stood with his arms limp at his sides and his eyes wide open. "Your honour is joking," he said. "No, I have missed the Carnatic, and I must be at Yokohama on the 14th at latest to take the boat for San Francisco." "Oh, I'm sorry," said the sailor, "but the thing's impossible." "I am prepared to give you £100 a day and a bonus of £200 if I get there in time." "Well, pilot?" said Mr. Fogg. "Well, your honour," he replied, "I cannot endanger my men, myself, and you by undertaking such a long voyage on a boat of scarcely 20 tons and at this time of year. Besides, we should not get there in time, for it is 1,650 miles to Yokohama." "Not more than 1,600, said Mr. Fogg. "That makes no difference." Fix breathed freely. "But," continued the pilot, "we might possibly manage it another way." Fix choked. "What way?" asked Phileas Fogg. "By going to Nagasaki, in the extreme south of Japan, a distance of 1,100 miles, or even to Shanghai, which is 800 miles from this port. After all, the San Francisco boat does not start at Yokohama. Yokohama and Nagasaki are ports of call, but the port of departure is Shanghai." "Are you sure of that?" "Quite sure." "When does the boat leave Shanghai?" "On the 11th, 7 o'clock in the evening. This gives us 4 days to do it in. 4 days makes 96 hours, so that with an average speed of 8 knots an hour, if we're in luck, if the wind remains in the southeast and the sea's calm, we can cover the 800 miles between here and Shanghai." "When can you start?" "In an hour. I just want time enough to buy provisions, get under sail." "Done. You are the skipper of the boat?" "Yes, I am John Bunsby, master of the Tankadere." "Would you like some earnest money?" "Well, if it's not inconvenient, your honour." "Take these £200 on account." Then Phileas Fogg turned round and said to Fix, "Sir, if you care to avail yourself of—" "I was just going to ask this favour of you," replied Fix resolutely. "All right. We shall be on board in half an hour." "But what about your poor servant?" said Aouda, who was excessively worried by Passepartout's disappearance. "I shall do all I possibly can for him," answered Phileas Fogg. Fix, nervous, restless and fuming, went to the pilot boat, and Mr. Fogg and Aouda made their way to the Hong Kong police station, where Mr. Fogg gave Passepartout's description and left sufficient money to take him back to France. Similar steps were taken at the French consulate, and, after going to the hotel to fetch their luggage, they returned in the palanquin to the outer harbour. At 3 o'clock punctually, pilot boat number 43, with her crew on board and her provisions stowed away, was ready to set sail. Phileas Fogg and Aouda went on board, whither Fix had preceded them. Skipper John Bunsby, having at last gained the open sea, the Tankadere took to the wind under her spanker, foresail and jibs, and leaped forward over the waves. During the last hours of the day, the Tankadere made her way through the capricious channels of Hong Kong, and whether under full sail or close hauled, or with wind astern, she behaved admirably. On the next day, November the 8th, at sunrise, the schooner had sailed more than 100 miles. In the evening, the log showed a run of 220 miles since leaving Hong Kong, and Phileas Fogg might hope that, on reaching Yokohama, he would have no loss of time to record in his diary. And in that case, the first serious mishap he had experienced since his departure from London would probably not interfere at all with his success. At daybreak the wind began to blow harder, and the sky showed signs of a coming gale. The barometer, too, announced an early change of weather by its daily vagaries, the mercury rising and falling fitfully. And the sea in the south-east was seen to rise in long surges, ominous of storm. The evening before, the sun had gone down in a red mist, in an ocean sparkling with phosphorescent light. The pilot, having long scanned the threatening appearance of the heavens, said, "Well, we are in for a squall." "Will it come from the north or the south?" asked Mr. Fogg quietly. "From the south. Look, there's a typhoon on the way." "That's all right. If it's a typhoon from the south, it will blow us in the right direction," answered Mr. Fogg. "Well, if that's the way you look at it, I've nothing more to say," replied the pilot. All sails were furled and the yards lowered on deck. The poles were struck and the boom taken in. The hatches were securely battened down, so that not a drop of water could get into the hull. A single triangular sail, a storm jib of strong canvas, was hoisted as a forestay sail, so as to keep the schooner's stern to the wind. Then they waited. The raging storm of rain and wind fell upon them about 8 o'clock. Though she had but one little bit of sail, the Tankederi was lifted like a feather by this wind, which defies accurate description when it blows its worst. To compare its velocity to 4 times the speed of a locomotive going on full steam would be short of the truth. During the whole of that day the vessel scudded northward, carried along by the monstrous waves, fortunately not lagging behind them in speed. 20 times she was on the point of being overwhelmed by the mountainous seas that rose behind her, but a skilful shift of the helm by the pilot prevented the catastrophe. The passengers were at times smothered in spray, but bore it stoically. Fix cursed, without a doubt, but Aouda, her eyes never leaving her companion, whose coolness filled her with admiration, showed herself worthy of him, and, unafraid, faced the tempest at his side. As for Phileas Fogg, the typhoon might have been a detail in his programme. Up till now, the Tankederi had held her course to the north, but towards evening the wind, as was to be feared, veered 3/4 and blew from the northwest. The schooner, now broadside onto the waves, was horribly shaken. Another day passed. From time to time one caught glimpses of the coast through rifts in the mist, but there was not a ship in sight. The Tankederi alone kept at sea. On the next day, the 11th, at daybreak, after examining the coastline, John Bunsby was able to declare that Shanghai was not 100 miles off. The breeze was slackening perceptibly. By 12 o'clock, the Tankederi was not more than 45 miles away from her destination. 6 hours remained in which to make the port before the departure of the Yokohama boat. It was absolutely necessary that the little schooner should keep up an average speed of 9 miles an hour, and the wind went on dropping. It was a fitful breeze, blowing from land in capricious gusts, which left the sea quite smooth as soon as they had passed. Still, the Tankederi was so light, her upper sails of fine material caught every flurry so well that John Bunsby, with a helpful current behind him, found himself at 6 o'clock no more than 10 miles from the mouth of Shanghai River. The town is at least 12 miles further up. At 7 o'clock they were still 3 miles from Shanghai. The pilot let fall an angry oath as he saw the bonus of £200 slipping from his grasp. He looked at Mr. Fogg. Mr. Fogg was quite unmoved, though at this moment his whole fortune was at stake. At this moment, too, a long, black, spindle-shaped object, crowned with a plume-like tuft of smoke, appeared on a level with the water. It was the American liner, leaving at the appointed time. "Curse it!" cried John Bunsby, thrusting away the helm with a jerk of despair. "Signal her," said Phileas Fogg quietly. A small brass cannon lay on the foredeck of the Tankederi for the purpose of making signals in foggy weather. This gun was loaded to the muzzle, but, just as the pilot was about to apply a red-hot coal to the touch-hole, Mr. Fogg said to him, "Put your flag at half-mast." The flag was lowered at half-mast, which was a signal of distress. It was reasonable to hope that the American ship, on seeing it, would alter her course for a moment so as to stand by the pilot-boat. "Fire!" said Mr. Fogg, and the report of the small brass cannon burst upon the air. But what had happened to Passepartout? Carnatic, having left Hong Kong on November the 7th at 6:30 in the evening, directed her course at full speed towards Japan. She carried a full cargo and her full complement of passengers. 2 quarter-deck cabins were unoccupied, those which had been engaged by Phileas Fogg. Next morning, the men in the bow of the ship were somewhat surprised to see a passenger who looked half-dazed, whose step was shaky and hair ruffled, come out of the second-class hatchway and totter as far as some spars, on which he sat down. The passenger was no other than Passepartout. What had happened was this. A few moments after Fix left the opium den, 2 attendants lifted Passepartout fast asleep and carried him to the bed reserved for smokers. But 3 hours later, pursued even in his nightmares by a fixed idea, Passepartout woke up and struggled against the stupefying action of the narcotic. The thought of duty unfulfilled shook off his torpor. He came out of the den, shouting as in a dream, "The Carnatic! The Carnatic!" The liner lay close by, with steam up, ready to start. Passepartout had only a few yards to go. He rushed onto the gangway, went as far as the foredeck, and there fell down insensible, at the very moment when the Carnatic was casting off. Sailors are used to scenes of this kind, so 2 or 3 carried the poor fellow down into a second-class cabin, and when he awoke next morning, he was 150 miles from China. Thus it was that on that morning Passepartout found himself on the deck of the Carnatic and came up to open his lungs to the fresh sea breeze. The first thing to do was to go to Mr. Fogg and obtain his pardon for the outrageous conduct of which he had been guilty. The purser told him he didn't know of any passenger of that name. "I beg your pardon," continued Passepartout insistently. "The man I mean is a tall gentleman who is very reserved and talks very little and has a young lady with him." "We have no young lady on board," replied the purser. "But here is a list of the passengers. See for yourself." Then, all of a sudden, the whole thing dawned on him. He remembered that the hour of the sailing of the Carnatic had been advanced, that he was to have informed his master of the fact, and that he had failed to do so. It was his fault, then, that Mr. Fogg and Aouda had missed the boat. Yes, it was his fault, but it was still more the fault of the traitor who, in order to separate him from his master and keep the latter in Hong Kong, had tempted him to drink to intoxication. He now quite understood the detective's trickery. By this time, Mr. Fogg was ruined to a certainty, for his bet was lost. He was arrested, possibly in prison. And here was he, a Frenchman, on the way to Japan. He was bound to get there. How should he get back? His pocket was empty. He hadn't a shilling, not a penny. But his passage had been paid for in advance, so that he had 5 or 6 days in which to make up his mind. His consumption of food and drink during this passage would beggar all description. He ate for his master, for Aouda, and for himself. He ate as if Japan, the land on which he would soon set foot, were a howling wilderness where no food whatever could be found. On the 13th, the Carnatic entered the port of Yokohama on the morning tide, and Passepartout set foot on this curious land of the sons of the sun without feeling the least excitement. He could go to the French or English consul at Yokohama, but he was loath to tell his story, so intimately connected with his master's. Before having recourse to this extreme measure, he resolved to exhaust all other possible means of facing his desperate position. When night came, Passepartout went to the native quarter and wandered about the streets lit by many coloured lanterns, watching the troops of dancers going through their wonderful performances, and the astrologers in the open collecting the crowd around their telescopes. On the morrow, Passepartout, tired out and famished, decided to pay a visit to the boats about to leave for America. His idea was to offer his services as cook or servant in return for his passage and food. Once at San Francisco, he would find some way of getting out of his difficulties. The thing that mattered was to cross the 4,700 miles that separate Japan from the New World. Passepartout, who was not the man to dilly-dally with an idea, at once directed his steps towards the docks. But as he drew nearer to his destination, his project, which had seemed so simple when he first conceived it, appeared more and more impossible of realization. Why should they require a cook or a servant on board an American liner? What recommendations could he produce in support of his application? What references could he give? As these thoughts were passing through his mind, his eyes fell upon an immense placard carried by a sort of clown through the streets of Yokohama. This placard was in English and ran as follows: Honourable William Batulkar's troupe of Japanese acrobats. Last performances before their departure for the United States of the Long, Long Noses, under the special patronage of the god Tingu. Great attraction. He followed the poster-bearer and was soon once more in the Japanese part of the city. A quarter of an hour later he stood before a large building at the top of which fluttered several clusters of streamers, and bearing on its outside walls, in crude garish colours but without perspective, the picture of a whole company of jugglers. Passepartout entered and asked for Mr. Batulcar. "Would you like a servant, monsieur?" Batulcar stroked his thick grey beard. "I already have 2. "But you're a strong fellow, eh?" "Yes, particularly when I have had a good feed." "Can you sing?" "Yes," replied Passepartout, who had once sung his part in a few street concerts. "But can you sing with your head down, a spinning top on the sole of your left foot, and a sword balanced on the sole of your right foot?" "Why, of course I can," answered Passepartout, recalling the first performances of his early years. "You see, everything depends on that," replied the Honourable Batulcar. The engagement was concluded there and then. Passepartout had at last found employment. He was engaged as a jack-of-all-work in the celebrated Japanese troupe. It was not a very gratifying position, but within a week he would be on his way to San Francisco. The performance, so noisily announced by the Honourable Batulcar, was to commence at 3 o'clock, and soon the fearsome instruments of a Japanese orchestra, drums and tom-toms, were thundering at the door. Needless to say, Passepartout had had no time to prepare a part, but he was to lend the support of his broad and robust shoulders in the wonderful feat of the human cluster, accomplished by the long noses of the god Tingu. This great attraction was to close the performance. Before 3 o'clock, the large hall was invaded by the spectators. Europeans, Chinese, Japanese, men, women, and children made a rush for the narrow benches and the boxes facing the stage. The musicians had taken up their position inside, and the full orchestra of gongs, tom-toms, bones, flutes, tambourines, and big drums was working frantically. The Long Noses form a peculiar company under the special patronage of the god Tingu. Attired like heroes of the Middle Ages, they sported a magnificent pair of wings at their shoulders. But their chief distinctive feature was the long nose which adorned the face, and even more the use to which it was put. These noses were actually bamboo canes, 5, 6, or even 10 feet long, some straight, others curved, some smooth, others covered with little knots. It was on these appendages, firmly fastened, that all their balancing feats were performed. A dozen of these followers of the god Tingu lay flat upon their backs, and their fellow actors settled on their noses, placed as straight as lightning conductors, jumping and tumbling from one to the other, and performing the most amazing feats. As a grand finale, special mention had been made of the human pyramid, in which some 50 long noses were to represent the car of Juggernaut. But instead of forming this pyramid by using their shoulders as the supports of the structure, the Honourable Batulcar's artistes were to use nothing but their noses. It so happened that one of those who formed the base of the car had left the troupe, and, as all that was required was strength and skill, Passepartout had been selected to take his place. He donned his garb of the Middle Ages, adorned with many-coloured wings, and a nose 6 feet long was adapted to his face. Then he took his place beside those who were to represent the base of the car of Juggernaut. They all lay down flat on their backs, their noses pointing skyward. A second set of equilibrists took up its position on these long appendages, then a third established itself on top, and then a fourth, and on these noses that met just at their tips, a human structure soon rose to the very borders of the theatre. The applause was more frantic than ever, and the instruments of the orchestra had just broken out like so many claps of thunder, when the pyramid tottered, the balance being destroyed through the failure of one of the noses at the base, and the structure collapsed like a house of cards. Passepartout was the man at fault, for, leaving his post, he had suddenly cleared the footlights, unassisted by his wings, clambered up to the right-hand gallery, and fallen at the feet of one of the spectators, crying out, "Ah, my master, my master!" "What, you here?" "Yes, I, and no mistake." "Well then, my friend, come with us at once to the boat." Mr. Fogg, Aouda, who was with him, and Passepartout hurried out through the lobbies, but outside they found the Honourable Batulcar, who was furious, and claimed damages for the breakage of the pyramid. His wrath was soothed by Mr. Fogg, who threw a handful of banknotes to him. At 6:30, just as the American boat was about to leave, Mr. Fogg and Aouda stepped on board, followed by Passepartout, with his wings still on, and the 6-feet-long nose, which he had not yet succeeded in removing from his face. What had happened when the pilot boat came in sight of Shanghai will be easily guessed. The signals of distress from the Tankaderi had been seen from the Yokohama boat, and the captain, observing a flag at half-mast, had directed his course towards the little schooner. A few minutes later, Phileas Fogg, paying the sum agreed upon for his passage, handed to the skipper John Bunsby £550. Then he, Aouda, and Fix got on board the steamer, which at once resumed her route for Nagasaki and Yokohama. Phileas Fogg arrived at his destination on the morning of the 14th of November at scheduled time, and, leaving Fix to attend to his business, went to the Carnatic, where he was told, to Aouda's great delight, and perhaps to his own, though he betrayed no sign of it, that the Frenchman, Passepartout, had actually arrived the day before. Phileas Fogg, who was due to leave for San Francisco that very evening, set out at once in search of his servant. He applied without success to the French and English consuls, and, having wandered about the streets of Yokohama without coming across Passepartout, was beginning to despair of finding him, when chance, or possibly a kind of presentiment, led him into the Honourable Batulcar's theatre. Without a doubt, he would never have recognized his servant in that fantastic heraldic garb, but the latter, lying with his face upwards, caught sight of his master in the gallery. He made an involuntary movement, which brought his nose out of position, thereby upsetting the balance of the pyramid, with the consequences that we know. Phileas Fogg advanced his servant a sufficient sum to allow him to procure on board garments more becoming than those he wore. Within an hour, the worthy fellow had cut off his nose and shed his wings, and had nothing about him that recalled the follower of the god Tingu. The boat about to sail from Yokohama to San Francisco belonged to the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, and was called the General Grant. She was a very large paddle-wheel steamer of 2,500 tons, well fitted up and very fast. As her speed was 12 miles an hour, she would not take more than 21 days to cross the Pacific. Phileas Fogg had therefore good reason for thinking that he would reach San Francisco by the 2nd of December, New York by the 11th, and London by the 20th, anticipating thus by a few hours the fateful date of the 21st of December. Mr. Fogg was as calm and reserved as ever. His young companion felt more and more that the ties which bound her to her protector were other than those of mere gratitude. The silent, yet more generous nature of the man impressed her more than she thought, and almost unconsciously she was giving way to feelings to which her inscrutable companion seemed absolutely impervious. And apart from sentiment, Aouda took the keenest interest in Mr. Fogg's plans, and worried over any mishaps that might endanger the success of the journey. She often chatted with Passepartout, who saw well enough what was going on in Aouda's heart, guarded though she was. 9 days after leaving Yokohama, Phileas Fogg had traversed exactly 1/2 of the terrestrial globe, For on the 23rd of November, the General Grant crossed the 180th meridian in the southern hemisphere and was therefore at the very antipodes of London. It also happened, on this 23rd of November, that Passepartout was greatly elated. It will be remembered that the obstinate fellow had stubbornly refused to make any alteration in the London time of his precious family watch, holding that the time of all the countries he passed through was wrong. Now, on this day, although he had never put his watch on or back, it agreed exactly with the ship's chronometer. One can easily imagine Passepartout's exultation. With what pleasure he would have jeered at Fix if he had been there. But where was Fix at that moment? He was actually on board the General Grant. On arriving at Yokohama, the detective, leaving Mr. Fogg, whom he expected to meet again during the day, had gone straight to the British consulate. And there he at last found the warrant, which had followed him from Bombay and was already 40 days old. It had been dispatched from Hong Kong by the Carnatic, the very boat on which he was supposed to be. The detective's disappointment may well be imagined. The warrant was now useless. The man Fogg, having left English soil, could only be arrested on an extradition order. "Very well," thought Fix, swallowing his wrath. "My warrant is of no use here, but it will be good in England. There is every indication that the rogue intends to return home, in the belief that he has thrown the police off his track. Very well, I shall follow him all the way there." Having made up his mind, he at once embarked on the General Grant, and was already on board when Mr. Fogg and Aouda arrived. He was astounded at seeing Passepartout, and hid himself in his cabin to avoid an explanation which might spoil everything. Owing to the large number of passengers, he was confident of escaping his enemy's notice when, on that very day, he found himself face to face with him on the foredeck. Without a word, Passepartout flew at him, seized him by the throat, and, to the great delight of certain Americans, who at once proceeded to bet on him, he administered to the wretched Fix a magnificent thrashing, thereby proving the great superiority of French over English boxing. When Passepartout had finished, he felt relieved, as it were, and composed himself. Fix got up in a somewhat battered condition, and, looking at his adversary, said to him coldly, "Have you done?" "Yes, for the present." "Then come and have a word with me." "A word with you? You want me?" "In your master's interest." As though subdued by the detective's coolness, Passepartout followed him, and they went and sat down right in the bow of the ship. "You have given me a hiding," said Fix. "That's all right, I expected it. Now attend to what I say. So far I have been Mr. Fogg's adversary. I am now playing on his side." "At last!" exclaimed Passepartout. "You believe he is an honest man?" "No," replied Fix coldly. "I believe he is a rogue. Hush! Don't move and let me speak. So long as Mr. Fogg was on English soil, it was my interest to keep him back until I should receive a warrant. I spared no effort to this end. I set the Bombay priests at him. I got you intoxicated at Hong Kong. I separated you from your master. I made him miss the Yokohama boat." Passepartout heard all this with clenched fists. "Now," resumed Fix, "Mr. Fogg seems to be on his way back to England. Well, I shall follow him there. But henceforth I shall exert myself just as zealously to remove all difficulties from his path as I have hitherto done to multiply them. As you see, my game is no longer the same, and for the simple reason that my interest requires a change. I may add that your interest is the same as mine, for in England, and in England only, shall you know whether you are serving a criminal or an honest man." Passepartout, who had listened to Fix with close attention, was convinced that he was perfectly honest in what he said. "Are we going to be friends?" asked Fix. "Friends? No," replied Passepartout. "Allies? Yes, but conditionally. For at the slightest sign of treachery, I shall wring your neck for you." "That's agreed," said the detective quietly. 11 days later, on the 3rd of December, the General Grant steamed into the Bay of the Golden Gate and reached San Francisco. So far, Mr. Fogg had neither gained nor lost a single day. At 7 in the morning, Phileas Fogg, Aouda, and Passepartout set foot on the American continent. The moment Mr. Fogg had landed, he inquired at what time the first train for New York would start, and was told 6 o'clock in the evening. Mr. Fogg, accompanied by Aouda, proceeded to go to the English consulate to have his passport visaed. On coming out of the hotel, he found his servant, who asked him if it would not be wise, before taking the train, to buy a few dozen Enfield rifles or Colt revolvers, as he had heard of Sioux and Pawnees holding up the trains just like ordinary Spanish brigands. Mr. Fogg answered that it was an unnecessary precaution, but he left him free to do as he thought fit, and directed his steps towards the consul's office. He had not walked 200 yards when, by the merest chance, he found himself face to face with Fix. The detective expressed the utmost surprise. What? Had Mr. Fogg and he crossed the Pacific together without meeting on board? Well, anyhow, Fix felt it a great honour to meet once more the gentleman to whom he owed so much, and as he must needs return to Europe for business reasons, he would be delighted to continue his journey in such pleasant company. Mr. Fogg replied that the honour would be his, and Fix, who was most anxious not to lose sight of him, asked if he might see this curious city of San Francisco with him. The request was granted, and Aouda, Phileas Fogg, and Fix were soon sauntering about the streets together. They found the streets teeming with people, and, in spite of themselves, were caught up in the crowd. It was a political meeting. This, at least, was Fix's opinion, which he imparted to Mr. Fogg, saying, "It might be well, sir, to keep out of this mob. There's nothing but blows to be got out of mixing with it." But Mr. Fogg, Aouda, and Fix found themselves between two fires. It was too late to escape. This torrent of men, armed with loaded sticks and clubs, was irresistible. Phileas Fogg and Fix were dreadfully hustled in their endeavour to protect the young woman. Mr. Fogg, as cool as ever, tried to make use of his fists, those natural means of defence of every Englishman, but in vain. A huge fellow with a red goatee, a ruddy complexion, and broad shoulders, who seemed to be the leader of the party, raised his dread fist over Mr. Fogg, to whom he would have done serious harm had not Fix devoted himself and taken the blow in his stead. An enormous swelling at once appeared under the detective's silk hat, which assumed the shape of a muffin cap. "Yankee," said Mr. Fogg, glancing at his enemy with the utmost contempt. "Englishman," replied the other. "We shall meet again." "When you please." "Your name?" "Phileas Fogg. And yours?" "Colonel Stamp Proctor." Thereupon the tide swept by. Fix was knocked down, but got up again without any serious hurt. His overcoat had been divided into two unequal parts, and his trousers were like those breeches of which it is the fashion among certain Indians to remove the seat before putting them on. Aouda was unharmed. Fix alone had suffered and bore the mark of the American's fist. As soon as they were out of the crowd, Mr. Fogg thanked the detective. "Don't mention it," replied Fix. They went back to their hotel and found that Passepartout was there, waiting for his master, armed with half a dozen central-fire six-chambered revolvers fitted with daggers. When he caught sight of Fix with Mr. Fogg, his brow darkened. But he brightened up again when Aouda told him briefly what had occurred. It was obvious Fix was no longer an enemy. He was an ally and was keeping his word. At 5:45, the travellers were at the station and the train was ready to leave. They took their seats and the train steamed out at full speed. From ocean to ocean, the Americans say, and these words ought to be the general designation of the Grand Trunk Line which crosses the United States of America at their broadest part. As a matter of fact, however, the Pacific Railroad is really divided into two distinct lines: the Central Pacific, between San Francisco and Ogden, and the Union Pacific, between Ogden and Omaha. 5 different lines converge upon Omaha, which is thus in frequent communication with New York. Thus, at the present moment, New York and San Francisco are joined together by an unbroken band of metal which is not less than 3,786 miles long. Such was the long artery which trains travel over in 7 days, and which would enable Mr. Phileas Fogg, at least so he hoped, to leave New York for Liverpool on the 11th. At 8 o'clock, a steward entered the car and informed the passengers that it was bedtime. In a few minutes, the carriage, which was a sleeping car, was converted into a dormitory. Next morning, after breakfast, Mr. Fogg, Aouda, and their companions resumed their comfortable seats in the carriage and observed the varied scenery that passed before their eyes. Vast prairies, mountains standing out on the horizon, and creeks with their seething, foaming waters. At times, a great herd of buffaloes, massing in the distance, looked like a moving dam. These innumerable hosts of ruminants often oppose an insuperable barrier to the passage of trains. Thousands of these animals have been seen filing past across the rails in serried ranks for hours together. The engine is then forced to stop and wait until the road is clear again. And the very thing happened on this occasion. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a herd of 10 or 12,000 head of buffalo blocked the way. The engine, after slackening speed, tried to drive its spur ram into the flank of the immense column, but the impenetrable mass brought it to a standstill. To try and stop such a migration was out of the question. When bisons have settled on a line of march, nothing on earth can arrest or alter their course. It is a torrent of living flesh which no dam can keep back. The travellers watched this curious sight from the platforms. But Phileas Fogg, to whom time must have been more precious than to anyone else, never left his seat, but waited philosophically until it should please the buffaloes to move out of the way. The march of the bisons lasted 3 full hours, and the line was not clear before nightfall, when the last ranks of the herd were crossing the rails and the first were disappearing below the southern horizon. It was 9:30 when they entered the territory of Utah, the curious land of Great Salt Lake and the Mormons. On December the 7th, Mr. Fogg and his partners had enjoyed a comfortable lunch served in their carriage, and had just returned to their endless whist, when a violent whistling was heard, and the train stopped. Passepartout put his head out of the window, but saw nothing to account for this stoppage. There was no station in sight. Aouda and Fix feared for a moment that Mr. Fogg might take it into his head to get down on the line, but all he did was say to his servant, "Just go and see what is the matter." Passepartout jumped down from the carriage. Some 40 passengers had already left their seats. Among them was Colonel Stamp Proctor. The train was stopped before a red signal which blocked the way. The engine driver and the guard had got down and were talking excitedly with a watchman whom the station master at Medicine Bow, the next station, had sent to meet the train. Some of the passengers had come up and were taking part in the discussion, one of them being Colonel Proctor, who was conspicuous for his loud tone of voice and hectoring manner. "Now look here," cried Colonel Proctor. "I suppose we are not going to be left here to take root in the snow." "Colonel," replied the guard, "we have telegraphed to Omaha for a train, but it is not likely that it will get to Medicine Bow in less than 6 hours. 6 hours? Cried Passepartout. Passepartout, on joining the group, heard the watchman say, "No, it is impossible to pass. The bridge at Medicine Bow is shaky and would not bear the weight of the train." Suddenly the engine driver called out, "Gentlemen, there might be a way of getting over. My idea is that if we sent the train on at its highest speed, we should stand a chance of getting across." In the end, all those who were interested in the matter fell in with the engine driver's opinion. "Take your seats! Take your seats!" shouted the guard. The passengers returned to their places. Passepartout went back to his seat without saying anything about what had happened. The engine whistled loud and long. The engine driver, reversing, backed the train for nearly a mile, on the principle of the jumper who takes a long run before leaping. Then there was a second whistle, and the train moved forward again, faster and faster, and soon the speed was terrific. All that was heard was one continuous screech from the engine, whose pistons were doing 20 strokes per second. Smoke came out of the axle boxes. There was a sort of feeling that the train was flying bodily at 100 miles an hour, and was no longer resting on the rails. Gravity was almost cancelled by velocity. And over they went, in a flash. Of the bridge they saw nothing. The train, it may be fairly said, leaped from one bank to the other and shot 5 miles beyond the station before the engine could be brought to a standstill. But hardly was the river crossed when the bridge, now completely ruined, collapsed and crashed into the rapids of Medicine Bow. 1,382 miles had now been travelled over from San Francisco in 3 days and 3 nights. 4 nights and 4 days, in all probability, would bring the travellers to New York. So Phileas Fogg was still within the prescribed time limit. The 101st meridian was passed. Mr. Fogg and his partners were busy with the cards once more. He was about to play a spade when a voice from behind his seat was heard saying, "I would play a diamond." Mr. Fogg, Aouda, and Fix looked up, and lo and behold, there was Colonel Proctor. Stamp Proctor and Phileas Fogg knew each other at once. As the American stared at his adversary in the most insulting manner, Passepartout would have flung himself upon him, but Fix got up, went to Colonel Proctor, and said, "You forget, sir, that I am the man you must deal with, for I am the man you not only insulted, but struck." "Mr. Fix," said Mr. Fogg, "pardon me, but this concerns me and no one else. When the Colonel maintained that I was wrong in playing a spade, he put a fresh insult upon me, and he shall give me satisfaction for it." "When you please and where you please," replied the American, "and with whatever weapon you please." There were not more than 9 or 10 passengers in the last carriage, and the guard asked them to be so good as to leave it vacant for a few minutes, as 2 gentlemen wished to settle an affair of honour. This request seemed most natural to the passengers, who withdrew to the platforms, professing themselves only too happy to oblige. The carriage, some 50 feet long, was very suitable for the purpose. The 2 combatants could advance against each other in the gangway between the seats and shoot with perfect comfort. They were to open fire at the first whistle of the engine. After a space of 2 minutes, whatever remained of the 2 gentlemen would be removed from the carriage. They were thus waiting for the whistle, the signal agreed upon, when suddenly the air was rent with savage yells. Cries of terror came from inside the carriages. Colonel Proctor and Mr. Fogg came out at once, revolver in hand, and rushed to the fore part of the train where shots and shrieks were loudest. They had at once understood that the train was being attacked by a band of Sioux. The first thing the Indians did was to rush to the engine, where they half killed the driver and stoker with blows of their tomahawks. A Sioux chief, wishing to stop the train, but not knowing how to work the handle of the regulator, opened wide the throttle valve instead of closing it, and the engine bolted at terrific speed. Having at the same time swarmed up the carriages, the Sioux were running about like infuriated apes over the roofs, bursting the doors open and fighting hand to hand with the passengers. The guard, who was fighting beside Mr. Fogg, fell, struck by a bullet, whereupon he cried, "Unless the train can be stopped within 5 minutes, we are lost." If the train went beyond Fort Kearny, not 2 miles distant, where there was an American garrison, it would be in the hands of the Indians before the next station could be reached. "Stopped it shall be," said Phileas Fogg, who prepared to rush from the carriage. "Stay, sir," cried Passepartout. "That is my job." While the bullets crossed each other over his head, he made his way under the carriages with the agility and litheness of his old acrobatic days. Clutching hold of the chains, helping himself along by means of the brakes and edges of the sashes, creeping from one carriage to the other with marvellous skill, he reached the front part of the train without being seen. There, hanging by one hand between the luggage van and the tender, he used the other to separate the safety chains. But, owing to the force of traction, he would never have unscrewed the coupling pin. Fortunately, a violent jolt of the engine snapped the pin, and the train, parted from the engine, was gradually left behind, while the engine itself raced ahead with increased velocity. Carried on by the force it had acquired, the train did not stop for some minutes, but the brakes were applied inside the carriages, and it came to a standstill less than 100 yards from Kearney Station. The soldiers of the fort, attracted by the firing, hurried up. The Sioux did not wait for them. The whole lot of them scampered away before the train had quite stopped. But when the passengers were counted on the station platform, it was found that 3 passengers, including Passepartout, had disappeared. As yet it was impossible to say whether they had been killed during the conflict or taken prisoners by the Sioux. When he realized that his servant was missing, Phileas Fogg said quietly to Aouda, "I shall find him, dead or alive." By this resolve, Phileas Fogg was making a complete sacrifice of himself. He had just decreed his own ruin. The delay of a single day would make him miss the boat from New York. His wager was lost irrevocably. The captain in command of Fort Kearney was there. About 100 of his men had taken up a defensive position in case the Sioux should attempt a direct attack upon the railway station. "You shall not go alone," he said to Phileas Fogg. 30 soldiers were selected, and an old sergeant placed at their head. "Thank you, Captain," said Mr. Fogg. "Will you allow me to accompany you?" asked Fix. "Sir, you will do as you please," replied Phileas Fogg. "But if you care to oblige me, you will stay behind with the lady. Should anything happen to me—" "I shall stay," said Fix. A few minutes later, Mr. Fogg pressed the young woman's hand, committed his precious travelling bag to her keeping, and went away with the sergeant and his little band. But before starting, he said to the soldiers, "My friends, there's £1,000 for you if we save the prisoners." About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the engine returned, running backward to Kearney Station. Aouda went up to the guard and said, "Are you going to start?" "Immediately, madam." "But what about the prisoners, our unhappy fellow travellers?" "I cannot stop the service," replied the guard. "We're 3 hours late as it is." "When will the next train pass here from San Francisco?" "Tomorrow evening, madam." "Tomorrow evening? That will be too late," cried Aouda. "Really, you must wait." "That's not possible," replied the guard. "If you wish to go, take your seat." "I shall not go," was Aouda's answer. Fix also remained. He wished to fight to the bitter end. Night passed, and it was 7 o'clock in the morning when gunshots rang out. Was it a signal? The soldiers rushed out of the fort and saw 1/2 mile off a small band of men returning in good order. Mr. Fogg was marching at their head, and near him were Passepartout and the 2 other travellers snatched from the hands of the Sioux. There had been a fight 10 miles south of Kearney. Just before the arrival of the detachment, Passepartout and his 2 companions were already at grips with their keepers, and the Frenchman had felled 3 with his fists when his master and the soldiers rushed up to their assistance. Rescuers and rescued were received with shouts of joy, and Phileas Fogg distributed the promised reward among the soldiers. Passepartout had no sooner arrived than he looked about for the train in the station. He expected to find it there, ready to proceed at full speed to Omaha, and he hoped it might yet make up the loss of time. "The train! Where's the train?" he cried. "Gone," answered Fix. He turned to Phileas Fogg and said, "Right. So you are 20 hours late. Between 20 and 12, the difference is 8. You have 8 hours to regain. Are you willing to try to do so?" "On foot?" asked Mr. Fogg. "No, on a sledge," replied Fix. "On a sledge with sails. A man has suggested this means of conveyance to me." He took Phileas Fogg to a hut below the fort and introduced him to an American called Mudge. There, Mr. Fogg inspected a somewhat strange vehicle. It was a kind of frame resting on 2 long beams, slightly curved upwards in front, like the runners of a sledge, and on which 5 or 6 people could find room. At a third of the length of the frame, forward, rose a very high mast with rigging for a huge spanker. It took but a few minutes for Mr. Fogg to come to terms with the skipper of this land craft. The wind was favourable, blowing fresh from the west. The snow had hardened, and Mudge was quite confident of being able to convey Mr. Fogg to Omaha Station in a few hours. From that place there are frequent trains and numerous railroads to Chicago and New York. There was a possibility of making good the loss of time. There could be no hesitation about chancing it. At 8 o'clock the sledge was ready to start. The travellers took their places and wrapped themselves up closely in their travelling rugs. The two great sails were hoisted, and, impelled by the wind, the vehicle slid over the hardened snow at 40 miles an hour.
"If nothing snaps,"
said Mudge,
"we shall get there in time."
It was Mudge's interest to get there within the time agreed upon, for Mr. Fogg, true to his method, had held out a handsome reward. It stopped at last, and Mudge, pointing to a collection of roofs white with snow, said, "Here we are." Passepartout and Fix jumped out, shook their benumbed limbs, and assisted Mr. Fogg and the young woman to get down. Phileas Fogg paid Mudge liberally, and then all hurried to Omaha Station. An express train was ready to start. Phileas Fogg and his party had only just time to get into a carriage. On the morrow, which was the 10th, at 4 o'clock in the evening, it arrived at Chicago. There were plenty of trains at Chicago, and Mr. Fogg was not kept waiting a moment. They boarded an express train. At last the Hudson came into view, and on the 11th of December, at 11:15 in the evening, the train stopped in the station on the right bank of the river, in front of the very pier of the Cunard Line, also called the British and North American Royal Mail Steam Packet Company. The China, bound for Liverpool, had sailed 45 minutes before. Phileas Fogg's last hope seemed to have gone with the China. The next day was the 12th of December. From 7 o'clock in the morning of the 12th to 8:45 in the evening of the 21st, they were left 9 days, 13 hours, and 45 minutes. If Phileas Fogg had left the day before in the China, one of the fastest boats of the Cunard Line, he would have reached Liverpool and then London within the required time. He went to the banks of the Hudson, and, looking about among the vessels moored to the quay or anchored in the river, he took careful note of those about to put to sea. Suddenly he saw a screw steamer. She was a trading vessel of fine lines, and her funnel, emitting puffs of smoke, showed that she was making ready to leave port. Phileas Fogg hailed a boat, got into it, and a few strokes of the oar brought him to the gangway ladder of the Henrietta, an iron-hulled craft whose upper works were all of wood. Phileas Fogg went up on deck and asked to see the captain, who was on board, and came forward at once, saying, "I am Andrew Speedy of Cardiff." Mr. Fogg asked him, "Are you willing to take me and 3 other persons to Liverpool?" "No. I am about to sail for Bordeaux, and to Bordeaux I go." "No matter what money I offer?" "No matter what money you offer." The captain spoke in a tone which admitted of no reply. "Possibly the owners of the Henrietta," continued Phileas Fogg. "The owners? I am the owners," answered the captain. Mr. Fogg then said to the captain, "Well, will you take me to Bordeaux?" "No, not if you paid me $200. "I offer you 2,000. "Per person?" "Per person." "And there are 4 of you?" "4. Captain Speedy began to scratch his forehead as if he were trying to tear the skin off. $8,000 to be made without changing his route. "I start at 9 o'clock, said Captain Speedy simply. "If you and your friends are ready to go on board—" "We shall be on board at 9, replied Mr. Fogg, in the same manner. They were all on board by the time the Henrietta was ready to weigh anchor. When Passepartout heard what the cost of this last voyage was going to be, he uttered a prolonged "Oh!" that ran through the whole descending chromatic scale. On the morrow, December 13th, at noon, a man went up on the bridge to take the ship's bearings. Of course, this man could be no other but Captain Speedy. Well, it was not. It was Phileas Fogg, Esquire. As for Captain Speedy, he was simply locked up in his cabin, roaring with pardonable rage. He was frantic. What had happened was simple enough. Phileas Fogg wanted to go to Liverpool, and the captain would not take him there. Whereupon Phileas Fogg had agreed to go to Bordeaux. But during the 30 hours he had been on board, he had handled banknotes with such skill and effect that the whole crew, sailors and stokers, a somewhat scratch lot who were on pretty bad terms with the captain, were devoted to him. Thus it was that Phileas Fogg was in command instead of Captain Speedy, that the captain was locked up in his cabin, and that the Henrietta was heading for Liverpool. One thing was clear, however, from the way Mr. Fogg handled the ship. Mr. Fogg had been a sailor. On the 13th, they passed the end of the banks of Newfoundland. A dangerous spot this, especially in winter when fogs are frequent and squalls dreadfully violent. The cold became sharper, and at the same time the wind shifted to the southeast. This was a misfortune. Mr. Fogg had to furl his sails and use more steam power so as not to get out of his course. Yet the vessel's speed slackened owing to the state of the sea. She pitched violently, and this delayed her progress. The 16th of December was the 75th day passed since the departure from London. Now, on this very day, the engineer came on deck, went up to Mr. Fogg, and had an earnest talk with him. Passepartout heard him saying to his master, "You must not forget that since we started, we've been keeping all our furnaces going, and while we had coal enough to go under easy steam from New York to Bordeaux, we have not enough to go with all steam from New York to Liverpool." The ship pressed on as before under full steam, but 2 days later, on the 18th, the engineer reported that the coal would run out during the day as he said it would. "Do not let the fires down," replied Mr. Fogg. "Far from that, let the valves be weighted for full pressure." About noon on that day, after ascertaining the ship's position, Phileas Fogg called Passepartout and ordered him to fetch Captain Speedy. In a few minutes, amid shouts and curses, a bomb tumbled onto the poop deck. The bomb was Captain Speedy, and it was obvious that the bomb was going to explode. "Where are we?" were the first words he uttered, choking with rage. 770 miles from Liverpool," answered Mr. Fogg, absolutely unperturbed. "You pirate!" cried Andrew Speedy. "Sir, I sent for you—" "You sea robber!" "To ask you to sell me your ship." "No! By all the fiends in hell, no!" "The fact is, I shall be obliged to burn her." "To burn my ship?" "Yes, her upper works at least, for we are running short of fuel." "Burn my ship?" cried Captain Speedy, who was now reduced to spluttering. "A ship worth $50,000? "Here are 60,000, replied Phileas Fogg, offering the captain a bundle of banknotes. In one instant the captain forgot his wrath, his confinement, in fact, every grievance he had against his passenger. His ship was 20 years old. There might be a fortune in this. The bomb was already non-explosive. Mr. Fogg had taken the fuse out. "And am I to keep the iron hull?" he asked in a peculiarly softened tone of voice. "The iron hull and the machinery. Is that settled?" "Done," said Andrew Speedy, seizing the bundle of banknotes, which he counted and slipped into his pocket. That day the poop deck, deck houses, cabins, bunks, and spar deck were all sacrificed. On the morrow, the 19th of December, the masts, rafts, and spars were burned. On the 20th, the greater part of the deck were given to the flames, and the Henrietta was now as flat as a hulk. But on that day they sighted the Irish coast. At 10 o'clock in the evening, they were still only abreast of Queenstown, and Phileas Fogg had not more than 24 hours in which to reach London. It would take the Henrietta all that time to get to Liverpool, even under full steam. And our much daring hero was at last on the point of having no steam left at all. Queenstown is an Irish port at which the transatlantic liners from the United States drop their mail bags. The letters are then carried off to Dublin by fast trains, always in readiness. From Dublin they cross over to Liverpool in boats of great speed, thus gaining 12 hours on the fastest vessels. Phileas Fogg meant to do like the American mail, and gain 12 hours also. Instead of arriving at Liverpool on the Henrietta in the evening of the next day, he would be there at noon, and so would have time to get to London before 9:15 in the evening. The Henrietta entered Queenstown Harbour at high tide, about 1 o'clock in the morning, and the travellers got into a train at 1:30, arrived at Dublin at dawn, and embarked immediately on a fast steamer. On the 21st of December, at 20 minutes to 12, Phileas Fogg at last landed on Liverpool Pier. He was now only 6 hours from London. At that very moment, Fix went up to him, laid his hand on his shoulder, and showing him the warrant, said, "There is no mistake. You are Phileas Fogg?" "Yes, I am." "In the Queen's name, I arrest you." Phileas Fogg, now in prison, was a ruined man, and just as he was reaching his goal. This arrest was quite fatal. Having arrived at Liverpool at 20 minutes to 12 on the 21st of December, he had till 9:15 to put in an appearance at the Reform Club. In other words, he had 9 hours and a quarter, and he only wanted 6 to reach London. At 33 minutes after 2, there was a sudden din outside the prison, and the doors were noisily thrown open. Passepartout's voice and Fix's voice were heard. Phileas Fogg's eyes brightened for one moment. The door of the lock-up opened, and he saw Aouda, Passepartout, and Fix rushing towards him. Fix, his hair all dishevelled, and so out of breath that he could not speak, mumbled, Sir, forgive me. A most regrettable resemblance. Thief arrested 3 days ago. You are free." Phileas Fogg was free. He stepped up to the detective, looked him straight in the face, and with the only quick motion he had ever made or would ever make, he drew back his arms and, with automatic precision, landed both fists on the wretched detective. Mr. Fogg, Aouda, and Passepartout left the custom-house, jumped into a cab, and a few minutes brought them to Liverpool station. Phileas Fogg asked if there was an express train about to leave for London. The time was then 40 minutes past 2, and the express had gone 35 minutes before. Phileas Fogg then ordered a special train. There were several fast engines with steam up, but owing to traffic arrangements, the special train could not leave before 3 o'clock. At 3 o'clock, Phileas Fogg, after saying a few words to the engine driver about a certain reward to be obtained, ran at high speed for London with the young woman and his faithful servant. He intended to accomplish the distance between Liverpool and London in 5 hours and a half, a perfectly possible achievement when the line is clear throughout. But forced delays occurred, and when Mr. Fogg reached the terminus, every clock in London informed him that it was 10 minutes to 9. After travelling all around the world, Mr. Fogg was 5 minutes late. He had lost his wager. After leaving the station, Phileas Fogg directed Passepartout to buy some provisions and went home. His fortune now consisted in the £20,000 deposited at Baring's, and these £20,000 were now due to his fellow members of the Reform Club. The expenses had been so heavy that had he won the bet, it would certainly not have enriched him. Moreover, it is probable that he had not sought to enrich himself, for he was one of those who bet for honour's sake, but the loss of the wager spelt absolute ruin. Howbeit, Mr. Fogg's mind was made up. He knew what he had to do. A room in the house in Savile Row was set apart for Aouda, who was distracted with grief. The first thing Passepartout did on arriving was to go up to his room and turn off the gas, which had been burning for 80 days. On the next day, and for the whole of that Sunday, the house in Savile Row might have been empty, and for the first time since he had lived there, Phileas Fogg did not set out for his club when Big Ben struck 11:30. About 7:30, Mr. Fogg sent word to Aouda asking whether she could see him, and a few moments later they were together alone in her room. "Madam," he began, "when I conceived the idea of taking you right away from that country which had become so full of danger for you, I was a rich man, and I intended to place part of my fortune at your disposal. Your life would have been one of happy freedom. Now I am ruined. However, may I have your permission to dispose in your behalf of the little I still possess?" "But, Mr. Fogg, what is to become of you?" asked Aouda. "Of me?" rejoined he coldly. "I have need of nothing. I have no friends or relations." "Mr. Fogg," said Aouda, stretching out her hand to him, "would you have at once a relation and a friend? Will you have me for your wife?" Mr. Fogg said simply, "I love you. Yes, in the name of all that is most holy, I love you, and am yours, heart and soul." "Oh!" cried Aouda, raising her hand to her heart. Passepartout was summoned, and came forthwith to see Mr. Fogg still holding Aouda's hand in his. He understood, and his big, round face beamed like the tropical sun at its zenith. Mr. Fogg asked him whether it would not be too late to give due notice to the Reverend Samuel Wilson of the parish of Marylebone. "Would tomorrow, Monday, do?" asked Mr. Fogg, looking at Aouda. "Yes, tomorrow, Monday," she replied, and Passepartout hurried off as fast as he could go. What a great change took place in English public opinion when it was known that the real thief, one James Strand, had been arrested on December the 17th at Edinburgh. 3 days before, Phileas Fogg was a criminal whom the police were making the most energetic efforts to capture. Now he was a most honest gentleman, mathematically performing his eccentric voyage around the world. And would he appear on Saturday the 21st of December at 8:45 in the evening on the threshold of the Reform Club drawing-room? Thus it was that, on the Saturday evening, a great crowd was assembled in Pall Mall and the adjoining streets. In the evening of that day, his 5 fellow members had been together in the large drawing-room of the Reform Club for 9 hours. The 2 bankers, John Sullivan and Samuel Fallentin, the engineer, Andrew Stewart, Gautier Ralph, the director of the Bank of England, and Thomas Flanagan, the brewer, were all waiting anxiously. At this moment, the clock indicated 8:40. "5 minutes more," said Andrew Stewart. 8:44, said John Sullivan, in a voice that betrayed his emotion. At the 40th second, nothing. At the 50th, still nothing. At the 55th, they heard a thunderous burst of noise outside, applause, hurrahs, and even curses, spreading far and wide in a continuous roll. The players stood up. At the 57th second, the door of the drawing-room opened, and before the pendulum beat the 60th second, Phileas Fogg appeared, followed by a delirious crowd that had forced their way into the club, and in his calm voice said, "Here I am, gentlemen." Yes, Phileas Fogg himself. You will remember that at 5 minutes past 8 in the evening, about 25 hours after the travellers arrived in London, Passepartout was sent by his master to arrange with the Reverend Samuel Wilson for a certain marriage ceremony which was to take place on the very next day. Passepartout set out on his errand highly delighted. He lost no time in reaching the clergyman's house, but he had to wait as the parson was out. He waited a good 20 minutes. When he left, it was 35 minutes past 8, and what a state he was in! Dishevelled, hatless, he ran along furiously, as never was man seen running before, knocking down the passers-by, rushing over the pavements like a waterspout. He was back in Savile Row in 3 minutes, and staggered out of breath into Mr. Fogg's room. He was unable to speak. "What is the matter?" asked Mr. Fogg. "My master," stammered Passepartout. "Marriage impossible." "Impossible?" "Impossible for tomorrow." "Why?" "Because tomorrow is Sunday." "Monday?" replied Mr. Fogg. "No, today, Saturday." "Saturday? Impossible." Yes, cried Passepartout. "You made a mistake of a day. We arrived 24 hours before the time, but there are only 10 minutes left." Passepartout had seized his master by the collar and was dragging him away with irresistible force. Phileas Fogg thus rushed without having time to think, left his room, then his house, jumped into a cab, promised the cabman £100, and, having run over 2 dogs and collided with 5 carriages, reached the Reform Club. The clock indicated 8:45 when he appeared in the big drawing-room. Phileas Fogg had accomplished the journey round the world in 80 days. Phileas Fogg had won his wager of £20,000. But how was it that a man who was so precise and scrupulously careful could possibly make this mistake of one day? Without suspecting it, Phileas Fogg had gained one day on the journey, and for the sole reason that he had travelled ever eastward. Going eastward, Phileas Fogg had advanced towards the sun, and consequently the days grew smaller for him by as many times 4 minutes as he crossed degrees of longitude in this direction. The Earth's circumference contains 360 degrees. These 360 degrees, multiplied by 4 minutes, make exactly 24 hours. That is, the day he had gained without knowing it. In other words, as he advanced eastward, he saw the sun pass the meridian 80 times, whereas his friends of the Reform Club in London saw it pass 79 times only. So it was that on that very day, which was Saturday, not Sunday, as Mr. Fogg believed, they were waiting for him in the drawing-room of the Reform Club. And the fact would have been recorded by Passepartout's precious watch, which had always kept London time, had it marked the days as well as the hours and minutes. So Phileas Fogg had won the £20,000. But as he had spent something like 19,000 on the way, the proceeds were small. The £1,000 that remained he divided between the worthy Passepartout and the luckless Fix, to whom he could not find it in his heart to bear any grudge. But, as a matter of principle, and for the sake of regularity, he deducted from his servant's share the cost of the 1,920 hours of gas consumed through his fault. That evening, Mr. Fogg, as calm and phlegmatic as ever, said to Aouda, "Is it still your pleasure to marry me?" "Mr. Fogg," she said in reply, "it is for me to ask you this question. You were ruined. You are now a rich man." "Pardon me, madam, my fortune is really yours. If the thought of this marriage had not occurred to you, my servant would not have gone to the Reverend Samuel Wilson's. I should not have been informed of my mistake, and—" "Dear Mr. Fogg," said the young woman. "Dear Aouda," replied Phileas Fogg. Needless to say, the marriage took place 4 hours later, and Passepartout, resplendent, simply dazzling, gave the bride away. Had he not saved her? Was not this honour his due? Next day, however, as soon as it was light, Passepartout banged at his master's door. The door opened, and Mr. Fogg, without the least excitement, asked, "What is it, Passepartout?" "Why, sir, I have only just this moment heard." "What have you heard?" "That we might have gone round the world in only 78 days. "Of course," replied Mr. Fogg, "by not going through India. But if I had not gone through India, I should not have saved Aouda. She would not have been my wife, and Mr. Fogg quietly closed the door.